You're listening to 102.9 WFPRLP, Franklin Public Radio.
Recording in progress.
Good evening. Time being 7 o'clock, I call the August 2nd meeting of the Joint Budget Subcommittee to order. Please pause for a moment of silence. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, a note to residents. All citizens are welcome to attend public board and committee meetings in person. Meetings are also live streamed and archived by Franklin TV on the Franklin Town Hall TV YouTube channel. Meetings are also shown live and on repeat on Comcast Channel 11 and Verizon Channel 29. In an effort to maximize citizen engagement opportunities, citizens will be able to continue to participate remotely via phone or Zoom. Tonight, the call-in number is 929-205-6099, and the Zoom ID is 836-4368-1839, and then you need to hit the pound sign. Once again, the Zoom ID 836-4368-1839 pound. And just to get us going this evening, I think I'd just like the panel or our Joint Budget Subcommittee to introduce themselves and the committee that they has served for. Why don't we start at this end, Nicole?
Sure. Nicole Corbacero, here representing the Finance Committee.
I'm Melanie Hamblin. Hello, everyone. Town Council.
George Conley, Finance Committee.
Dave McNeil, school committee member and chair of the school committee budget subcommittee.
Dave?
Dave Callahan, School Committee.
Kobe Frangilla, Franklin Town Council.
Denise Spencer, School Committee.
Good evening, Brian Chandler, Town Council.
Tom Mercer, chairman of the Joint Budget Subcommittee and chairman of the Town Council. Okay, before we get started, just thought it was important for a lot of people to understand the Joint Budget Subcommittee, what it was put together for, why, and who serves on it. And basically, it's made up of subcommittees of 3 town committees: Franklin Town Council, School Committee, and the Finance Committee. There are 4 members from the Town Council, there are 3 members from the School Committee, and there are 3 members from the Finance Committee. And I'm sure 1 or 2 of you might have a question, why is there 4 Town Council and 3 School Committee? It's because you can't have a quorum of a committee on a subcommittee. So there are 7 members of the School Committee, so if you had 4, then it would be a school committee meeting, and you would break the open meeting laws. With the same thing with the council, except that we're 9 members, so there are 4 counselors. So that's how this committee was put together. And the charge to the Joint Budget Subcommittee, which we did a couple of years ago, was to promote collaboration among the 3 most relevant finance-related committees who are involved in the town's annual operating budget: Town Council, School Committee, Finance Committee. And also to promote broader communication and public engagement on the town's annual operating budget, keeping their respective board or committee members informed of the subcommittee's work and providing updates, meeting as often as necessary to achieve subcommittee goals, maintaining institutional knowledge of short and long-range budget forecasts, assisting the town administrator and the superintendent of schools to develop strategies for meeting projected budget shortfalls. In short, that's what this committee was put together for, and it's been, I think we only had a couple of meetings last year. My plan is to have substantially more of these as we move forward and as we look into the future. Before I turn it over to Jamie and go on to item 2, I want to quickly outline the discussion framework for tonight. The item on the agenda is the 5-year fiscal forecast. The projections, assumptions, concerns, comments, budget mechanics, and so on. No decisions are going to be made tonight. There's no vote. But hopefully, a snapshot into the future for a long-range financial planning. I want to make sure we have the time to close the loop on this topic. Like everyone up on this rostrum, I've been asked by many in the community about the process for an override, the need for an override, when for an override, and so forth. I asked the town administrator to attach the slides he presented at the Finance Committee in May tonight to help continue to get that information to the community. The mechanics of an override and how it relates to the forecast could be discussed. But we should not have a deeper discussion about whether or not to have an override, how much or when, because we don't have enough information yet. As I've said on many occasions, this is the starting point, where we needed to get to start this process. I've also asked Jamie to have his slide available at the August 16th meeting of the Town Council, where there will be an agenda item that focuses exclusively on the process of an override, as well as the legal, political, and ethical issues that surround overrides and ballot questions. I'm committed to helping to educate the community on this journey, but I do believe we need to take things step by step. And seeing the number of people here this evening and the number of people on Zoom, this is a great first step. It's been heartwarming for me to see that the One Franklin group has started to form again. It's been a few years, pre-COVID, since we've last seen the level of engagement that group already has going. As I think Jamie noted, there's been a lack of grassroots organizing on an override for many of our past overrides. Not debt exclusions, but past overrides. We did have some very good grassroots for the debt exclusion on the high school and some of the other debt exclusions. As I think Jamie noted, I'm thrilled to see a dedicated group of folks that are ready to dig into the details of overrides and ballot questions. They are doing thankless work, but we thank them for sacrificing their own time, your own time, to help organize this group. But most in the community still have a lot to learn about the town's overall financial situation. We will all learn more tonight, as well as at the council meeting in August, and then again, I am sure, in the fall. Personally, I believe an override is needed, just to continue the current level of services being provided to the community. The community has discussed this for years, but I also think the most important piece of this is to put a question before the voters that they will support. A question that shows the community respect and brings the community along together. Because we are, and I'll use your phrase, we are one Franklin. So often you hear the municipal part of government, you won't hear me say sides because I hate that word. So there's a municipal part of the government and there's a school part of the government. And we need to work together. And that's my hope for this joint budget subcommittee over the next whatever, to put together and work together to come up with a fiscal forecast looking out the next 5 years. We can't just look for tomorrow or next year. We have to look out beyond that. We have to look out 5 years at a minimum. And then I think it's important for everybody, for all of our department heads, the municipal part, school part to let us know what they need over the next 5 years. Not saying they're going to get everything they need, but what truly would you need if there wasn't a budget shortfall? We need to talk about those numbers, and we need to come to some sort of a decision down the road. And again, this is going to take some time to put all of this information together, because when you put all those numbers together into, to coin Mr. Frangillo's phrase that he's used many times, the pot's only so big. And I brought one. And it's important as we come to whatever that large number is going to be, we have to then look at all parts of it and get it down to a number that we can present to the community that they will support. Because if my fear is that we rush to something, put a number out there, and then that number's either too low or too high a year from now. And you can't do that. You have to have the information. We have to develop the information. What we're going to hear tonight from the town administrator is a fiscal forecast looking out the next 5 years on the municipal part of the government. We also need the school part of the government to be looking at the same thing out to the next 5 years and bringing that to this committee, because I think this is where it needs to get vetted first. Because when you come out of this committee with the support, you have the support of the finance committee, of the council, and of the school committee. So you're coming out with the letters on your shirt. You're coming out one Franklin. And I truly believe that's why we're all here. So with that, I've spoken longer than I wanted to, but Jamie, you want to?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So really quickly through the committee, I thought it would be advantageous to do a few updates from the budget presentations in May. Just to catch all of the audience behind us and on Zoom up. Number one, as most people know, the council did shift about $750,000 in June after a couple of votes to shift about $750,000 of municipal and public safety funds to the Franklin Public Schools, which is critical because that got them to their $1.8 million, 2.5% increase this year, which is really quite effective given, as everybody heard in the spring, the impacts of inflation were pretty substantial in FY24. And so that's really great news. Second, as the chair just mentioned, I made a commitment to the town administrator and the town attorney to have a public meeting about the mechanics of an override, about the ethical and legal considerations. That will be on August 16th at 7 o'clock. Third, that same meeting, I made a commitment. It was high level, but more specifics now. The town, I made a commitment to continue throughout the fiscal year to work with the schools and the community and our departments to do anything we can to try to offset some of maybe the expenses for the school department or find other revenue sources. On August 16th, there'll be a vote for the opioid settlement funds to pay for the William James Institute contract, which will save the district at least one vote, $35,000, and that vote will be on August 16th as well. I just also want to mention I made a commitment, as well as the superintendent, to really work on the reorganization of some of the departments due to succession planning and some of the staff retirements and transitions that have happened. And I'm really, really happy and pleased to say that the work with the superintendent and assistant superintendent, our staff, have gone fantastically well over the summer. We are really hoping, fingers crossed, it's gone so smoothly and so well, we hope that after Labor Day and into the fall, we'll be able to talk about some more details. But I'm very confident and optimistic that there'll be some additional savings in there for the school department, but more importantly, additional capacity for both the town and the school, main finance and businesses offices, which for me is a huge priority. And third, the legislators were here on July 19th, and both Rep. Roy and Senator Roush had some positive news about the out-of-district tuition placement costs, right? There's a supplemental budget moving through the legislature at about $75 million. There's still a lot to be worked out, but the key is that at that number, we would hope Franklin would see a pretty large amount of that, which will also save, the school district an unidentified amount, but originally we were looking at about a $750,000 savings if the legislature did that, right? So when you add all these things up, right, you're really looking at a fairly large increase for FY24 and hopefully a fairly sustainable budget, depending on exactly what the priorities are. But Mr. Chairman and the committee, I just wanted to give those updates. We talked about those in May, and just wanted to get those out there. Relative to the fiscal forecast, I got it up on the screen. I know that people have very little time these days, but if people have questions, this is all written down in the memo. It's only 3 or 4 pages. I want to make sure everyone's very clear. This is not the budget for the next 5 years. This is a forecast, and we're just looking out. So I'm just going to go through the assumptions in the model. Based off the assumptions that are here for revenue first. And folks have seen this who have been paying attention for a little while now. The revenue sheet, this is our budget. If folks look up at the tax levy, this number here is really 2.5%. Here's FY24 as our baseline, 25, 26, 27, 28. All we did here is keep new growth as an assumption across the board as the same revenue source, so there is no plus or minus in those numbers. The tax levy is 2.5%. This is the infamous Prop 2.5. We can only raise the levy limit 2.5% over the previous year, unless, again, there was a debt exclusion or an override. We'll talk about those in a minute. So those numbers just go right across the board. As I said in the budget meeting, you cannot just stop there to determine your annual tax levy. Debt exclusions, as folks will see and discussed in the budget narrative, you can see these little hashtags here. Those aren't typos. That means the Keller-Sullivan project as a debt exclusion sunsets in 26, the Horace Mann 27, and so forth. So wherever you see those hash marks, that means voters in Franklin passed a debt exclusion, a tax increase. People will not see the tax sunset off the tax rate, but it is baked into the tax rate calculation. So when the council addresses the tax rate in the fall, the winter, those numbers are actually incorporated into that. And the main point with that is the potential tax levy, because those tax increases sunset, you end up having lesser of a tax increase and a tax levy from year to year because those things are coming off the books. And I won't get into it too deep with debt and interest, but the same concept happens with debt and interest, and we'll go through that in a minute. So the other assumptions in the revenue model are pretty easily outlined. Local receipts is assumed at a 2% growth model. State aid as a revenue source right here is assumed across the board as a 1% increase. And that's what we've been getting. And that actually is generous. In truth, we've had Jeff Roy, Becca, Karen Spilka, everyone's talked about this for years. I mean, it is what it is. I know the final budget got done, and the conference committee budget actually is $2,000 less than the budget that was voted by the council in June. And this is, again, when we talk, not tonight, but about hold harmless funding and a variety of other things about state finance, the truth of the matter is we cannot rely on state aid for any additional revenue. A 1% growth over 5 years would actually be sustainable and would be good. And then the other assessments and votes down the bottom on the revenue model are outlined here, and basically these are things that I encourage people to not just look at Chapter 70. When the MMA and other organizations put out positive comments about doubling the per pupil cost or other big, huge numbers that are in the budget, I'm just here to tell everybody it doesn't impact the town at all. It just doesn't. So in the grand scheme of it, because there are deductions that come off those formulas. The large one, of course, is the charter school assessment we've talked about many years. And so if you look at this model here, we are anticipating over the next 5 years, by FY29, we're going to have a $6.5 million deduction off of our local aid to compensate for the charter school reimbursement formula. So I'm going to get into these red numbers later on. That's the revenue model. All the assumptions are there. I would encourage everybody to just remind themselves that these are just simply assumptions and projections year to year. We're obviously going to have to go through budget debates every year, but that's the revenue model. I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman. If anybody has any quick questions on the revenues, I'm happy to answer them.
Sure.
Before we go on to the expenditures, we'll take a few more minutes.
Okay. Any questions from the committee on the revenue part of Jamie's forecast? Anyone out in the audience? Council chambers, I should say. How about anyone out there in Zoom land? Oh, I'm sorry, please. Just, if, coming forward, please, just name and address. You know the gig. We would be surprised.
I miss being on that side. I'm Susan Dusnap, 10 Garden Street. I would just like to ask a quick question, Jamie, and I'm sure you probably know it off the top of your head. With the Chapter 70 school aid, I'm going to say something maybe to help some folks who are learning how these numbers work. Those numbers are not calculated by us, they're calculated by the state. Do you know how much above the current calculation we receive under that hold harmless? Over the hold harmless. So if we were to just get what was calculated for us, what would that number be?
I don't know.
Does anybody know how much we receive over the calculation number? Is it 11 million, 14 million that I heard?
The hold harmless number, I think, is like around 14 or 15 million.
Yeah.
So if the hold harmless number is the question, it's about 14 to 15 million.
Okay.
14
So,
and change.
We're second in the state to the city of Boston.
so I just wanted to point that out. I think it's a very, very important point for people to understand that even though we're receiving $29 million of Chapter 70 school aid, if we were only receiving what we were calculated to receive under the current calculation used by the State House, it would be much lower.
If I think I see Sue's question now. So
15 million.
to explain
Yes.
hold harmless,
It would be 15
essentially hold harmless is literally what it says. The state Chapter 70 formula essentially holds harmless districts with significantly declining enrollment. And so ultimately, that formula has a safety net for communities like Boston and like Franklin and many others across the Commonwealth that have a lot of declining enrollment over even a short time or a long period of time. In Boston and Franklin's case, the reason why hold harmless is so large is because over the last 13 or 14 years, the declining enrollment has been so steadily and consistent because of the growth in the 90s and the early 2000s. In 2008, the district had almost 6,500 students, and in September, I believe the school business administrator had predicted a budget based on about 4,600 students. So you're looking at about 15 years of decline of about 1,900 students. That's the hold harmless formula, and that's the part of the genius of Chapter 70. Because I think your point was, Sue, if you didn't have that hold harmless feature in state law, that number would probably be sliced in half.
Yes.
Right.
Which
That
means
is
we would be $14 million less on the revenue model. And I don't know if I'd be here.
I just
Like,
thought it was
that's
important.
makes you sweat a little.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a
I just
lot of,
wanted to point that out, because that's
yeah.
the one thing that, as I look at numbers, I worry about, right?
Mm-hmm.
At some point in time, will somebody, if a legislature changes, whatever, could they start to reduce that number?
They
They
could.
haven't,
They
but
haven't.
let's not keep that out of the realm of possibility. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Sue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good point. Mr. Sherlock.
Steve Sherlock, 10 Lawrence Drive, community journalist. As points like this may continue to come up, and there'll be good points to note for everybody, can we get a clarification, maybe a further? My numbers, I think this year was 11 million, dropped it down to 10. I agree, there had been at 14 at one point. There's also an 82% piece that we have to get to. Can that particular number just be tabled at this point, but then updated to get the accurate? Because I know Miriam is no longer here, but Mr. Peach can give us the numbers, and that way we have the right base as we go forward, sir. Thank you.
But
Again, we were talking in approximates here.
really quickly, Mr. Chairman, to Steve's point, 10 million, 12 million, 13 million, 9 million, 18 million, it's a huge liability at the end of the day. It could be 8 million, 5 million. It's a huge liability because, as Sue pointed out, if for some reason there was a budget crisis at the state level and they needed to cut money somewhere, I can assure you the legislators that have growing districts with enrollment, they all know where the districts are with the declining enrollment. They're never going to take away the whole amount. But even if they sliced 10% or 15%, that's still a significant amount of money that is going to have a huge impact on the bottom line for the town of Franklin, not just the schools, I'm saying for the town of Franklin. So I think the numbers, to Steve's point, are going to shift. Just want to make sure people understand whatever the number is, hold harmless is a huge liability for the community. Revenues?
That's one we want to keep. Are there is there any other question from council chambers on the revenue part of the forecast? Is there any questions out there in Zoom land? I don't see any. Amy, do you? No. Okay. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. Please, just come forward, name and address, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jenny Gordon, 37 Town Line Road. Thanks for the opportunity. So I just wanted to understand, I noticed on the revenue side there's no federal line. I'm new to the process, but I was wondering if you could just give a little bit of background on if we have had federal funding in the past tied to COVID or any other line, and if that's part of our problem, and if we expect any federal funds in the next 5 years?
Phenomenal question. One, federal fund, the municipal part of the town of Franklin does not receive any federal money. Occasionally we get a grant or two, like the New Style, but in terms of the budget, there's $0 of federal money in this. And the same thing would be said for the school part. The one thing I would clause that is the schools get federal money through other sources that are not a part of the actual this operating budget. In terms of federal stimulus money, like ESSER funds, CARES Act, ARPA funds, those types of things, those one-time revenues, those are completely off the books. They are not part of this model at all. The town of Franklin has not used any federal monies over the last 3 years to plug any part of the budget. Nothing. But I don't know for sure. I would have to ask the superintendent or the school business administrator. I believe federal ESSER money, you guys know better than me, I believe federal ESSER money has, in fact, been used in the school budget. So to your point, those federal dollars, when they dry up, will end up leaving a larger gap in the school department budget because they've been funding some of their operational costs with federal stimulus money. I hope that was clear. Did that make sense?
Dave, sure.
Not to,
please,
to throw any hard numbers, but yet, and when Jamie kind of talks about how that money's being dried up, especially when it came to the ESSER funding that was COVID money, and that legally had to be spent by, it would be in this case, it would be this budget. And there are a number of positions that otherwise kind of would be in the operating budget currently in the Franklin School District that are exclusively being funded through the ESSER funding, which just does not exist for FY25. That money is gone. The money that's attached to those positions will have to either be found within the operating budget, or it does not exist for the next budget cycle. And so there's a large revenue stream that has been present within, especially in the school side, since COVID, through a lot of ESSER funding, through CARE for ARPA, through federal funding that no longer will be existing.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Was there anyone out in Zoom? We didn't see anybody, Amy, right? Jamie?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I would just, for her question, I would say, not part of the operating budget, but one thing to take note of is CARES Act funding, for example. This town did use $1 million in CARES Act one-time money for Chromebooks, right? So that is something that I think is a discussion point in the future. That's not part of this discussion on the operating budget, but there's going to be more requests for Chromebooks, and that, that's something that I think we're going to all have to listen to and consider how to deal with some of the infrastructure stuff where we did use one-time money to pay for some of those things during the pandemic. Those are costs that are going to be borne somewhere else, either off budget or in budget, over the next year. So the operating budget expense. This is just, again, a 4 or 5 page model. I'm just going to run through really quickly some of the assumptions. This model assumes a 2.5% increase. Folks can see up here. You can see on the municipal part of the budget, you have like a department like the assessors. We have personnel and salaries, and then we have an expense line item for each department. And essentially, the vast majority of these line items, from a personnel standpoint, one for contractual obligations, is assumed at a 2.5% across the board on every municipal part. Every department has an assumption in there of a 2.5% personnel COLA increase on every line item. When we go down to account 300, the assumption in here, and I highlighted it in green, I'll get to regional dispatch in a minute. As folks can see up here on the school, both Tri-County, we'll talk about in a moment again, but for town schools right here across the board, that's just 2.5% across the board. So that's compounded, so by FY29, it's about a $2 million increase. So you're looking at about a $1.8 to $2 million increase at a 2.5% rate of growth over the course of the next 5 years. All municipal expense budgets in here also assume a 2.5% rate of growth. Yes, there will be, when we get into those budget years, one expense budget might be 1%. But I know, I'm sure later on there'll be questions for like a Brutus and Mike about, do we expect their cost of their expenses to go up 2.5%? I just want to note, as we have before, most of the facilities department expense line item actually is for the school. Well, most of the facilities department in general actually pays for school-related costs. If you look at account 192, that's the custodians, that's all the parts for the buildings, that's for contractors to fix things, to upgrade things, that's for electricity, plumbing, gas, all the utilities, stormwater. All of those costs for school facilities are in the municipal part of the budget, okay? So each year we get creative, and I'm sure there'll be questions on it, but I'm just assuming a 2.5% rate of growth for even the DPW, where we heard this year both inflation hit the DPW and facilities very, very hard. Well over $1 million increase just from inflation in those two departments. But just for the model's sake, to make it easy, I made it about a 2.5% growth. Norfolk County retirement down the bottom. We assume in here essentially a 5% rate of growth for the Norfolk County retirement system, and we also project healthcare expenses in the budget at 7%. It's worth noting the numbers up here for health insurance. Whoops, sorry, Mel, I got you with the pointer.
It's okay. The pointer was my idea.
Is at a 7%. This is for municipal health care right here. I believe traditionally, Miriam and I, we always generally had the same rate of growth for health care, the same assumption. I bet you she would say the same thing. Bob would probably say the same thing, 6, 7, 8%. But at this point, you ballpark 7%. And then all of these other retired teacher health insurance, the town's part pays for this. Non-GA school retirees, workers' comp, these are all municipal expenses, but they're actually all school expenses, but they're in the municipal part of the budget. All of those are at a 2.5% rate of growth. So the only two anomalies here are Norfolk County and in healthcare. I did mention a minute ago the regional dispatch, which is in green up here. We've talked about this for years. People will see in the model, why 958 to 1.5 million? That's a pretty big jump. How does that happen? We had a very, very lucrative 5-year grant from the Commonwealth. That party is over in FY25, and it was a party we saved a lot of money, which has been able for us to get through COVID. There's no question about that. The 6 towns that make up the Regional Dispatch Center, I'm the chairman of the board for the last 5 years now. I can't emphasize how much that grant helped out the entire town be able to get through the last few years. But next year, we're going to see a full assessment around 1.5 million, and then we bake in a rate of 2.5% moving forward. And then the last point in the assumption model that's really worth noting, or second to last point, is the Tri-County School. We're anticipating in FY27. At this point, it could be FY28, could be FY29, could be FY30, but we know there will be a ballot question vote this October on authorization of the school. Once that vote goes through, the town of Franklin is then on the hook to pay the bill. How we pay it, we can be creative. Okay?
Our portion.
Our portion of the bill, right? Not the whole thing. But we're the second largest town in the district, so we pay the second highest portion after North Attleboro. So our portion is going to be the second highest. We anticipate a $2.1 million expense for 30 years. So you can see here in the model, people may say, why Tri-County going up so much? I went in FY26, we expect their number to be 2.9 million as an assessment, but in FY27, that'll go up by 2.1 million. Again, these are all assumptions. They still have to go out and borrow for it. They still got to get a 4.25 interest rate. They may not. It could be higher, it could be a little lower, but right now, for model's sake, and then we build in a 2.5% growth over that. That won't happen. But we'll get a full borrowing schedule, as you know, Mr. Chairman, and many others. We'll get a full borrowing schedule once that goes through. I just want to make sure everyone's clear. We have to solve our own portion of the Tri-County School. So I've made a mention in the memo. That's going to take some wizardry on my part if there's no debt exclusion or some sort of vote to increase taxes to pay for that school. There's no rainy day fund to pay for this for 30 years. I mean, you can pay 1 year maybe and drain the fund, but structurally, that's going to be a tough issue. As I mentioned in the budget memo, for those that you want to read, if the town doesn't somehow raise the revenue to do this, then you're going to see a $2.1 million deduction in the town of Franklin's budget spread across the board. So, something to think about. And then finally,
Jamie, while you're on that,
yeah.
what's the time frame in which we have to come up with a funding source? Once a school is passed, everybody understands that that's a vote of 11 different communities, but it's a total combined vote. It's not just every town. So it's a combined vote. But what do we have for a time frame to come up with a source of funding?
We have, from the date of the authorization of the vote.
I know the answer.
I know, it's a great question. And through the date of when the bill comes in. And I don't want to give a date. I'm probably potentially a little early on my model up here. But as you know, as well as anyone who's done school buildings, Mr. Chairman, they still have to make it through the MSBA process. And then once we get through all of that, probably next year, we'll have a more definitive borrowing schedule. We could be looking at the hit probably 3 or 4 years. So at any point in between, the town can try to devise its strategy on how to pay for that. And then finally, on the same token, and I just got to read my memo. So a couple years ago, retirement of debt. People have heard this about me. I know it's boring, but this is something people really can't find boring. Why? This is your school buildings. So I see this as one of the most important things we do. And this is the quality of our facilities. And so over the years, debt, like debt exclusions, has come off the books, the library, a variety of projects. And so I've been saying for years, if you hold that up again, that pie, the slice of that pie going towards borrowing or capital investments in municipal buildings and school buildings has slowly declined. And that has allowed more capacity in the budget pie to go towards operational needs. The downside to all of that, especially in this interest rate market, is if we go out to borrow to do the Remington Jefferson remodel, if we go out to do the Washington Street sidewalk, if we go out to do the high school improvements, including the bleachers and some of the 10-year upgrades that we've talked about, and the council has already authorized the borrowing for all of these projects. We did it in 2020, right? And the recycling center. We basically went in and said, okay, what do those numbers really look like? And you can see here in FY26, we predict, okay, that we'll go out maybe in a year, year and a half, and go out and borrow for those. We've assumed those at a rate of about 4.25% with even the AAA bond rating, because we just got just under a 4 last year for the farm, Schmidt's Farm. Interest rates don't look to be getting much better. But, you know, with a little time, hopefully in a year, we're hoping that maybe in a year, year and a half, things will settle down a little bit. So we modeled into this model those projects that have already been authorized. That does not include the police station. That does not include the 5 to 7 million that's needed if we're going to keep Parmenter for the long haul. That's another renovation project like Remington Jefferson. That's a roof, that's a playground, that's boilers, that's all that stuff. It's fixed costs. And so this does not include any of those. And I lay all that out in here. I literally say, what does this model not include? But it's important to point out those borrowing costs and those interest costs hit. And everyone can see on the interest rate alone, you're almost more than doubling your cost just to do those projects, right? So if we want those projects, particularly in my opinion, Remington Jefferson, which is really needed at its 30-year capacity and probably has another, I don't know where Mike went, but probably another 30 years after with a proper remodeling of the school, you know, we're going to have to pay for that. And why is that important? Because that's going to eat into the operational capacity. So all those assumptions at 2.5% aren't going to work. Why? Because if you look down at the model here, FY25, we're looking at a deficit of only a couple $100,000. But in FY26, when the borrowing comes on, you're looking at a deficit of 1.6. And then the next year, 3.4 when Tri-County hits. And then 2.5 and 2.4. So even with those assumptions right there, we're already way in the red looking out 2 years from now. And so, you know, I think for FY25, I will admit, I think, Mr. Chairman, we've talked about it at the council level and everywhere, we all really thought FY25 would be very punishing. And ultimately, some of the delay in Tri-County's project and some of these other capital facilities projects are helping shift that burden on possibly a year later or several years later. And also with the MEC stabilization fund and the policy that the council did to make sure that we saved for that day when that huge hit was going to come, you know, we're going to be able to get through FY25 based on some of these assumptions, at least the projections. I mean, I just remind everybody that we're only 1 month into FY24, and all the projections and budgets that are approved, we don't have the money yet. We haven't spent the money yet. State didn't just write a check this week for $29 million, right? Like, I mean, this takes the whole year to make sure all the revenues that we anticipated come in. So the message is, and I know Councilor Hamlin's been good of us and everybody, meals tax, eat out in Franklin. If you're looking for a night away from the kids, maybe book a hotel in town. We get a 6% hotel tax on that.
That's right.
Okay? I am not up here promoting cannabis, but if that's your thing, buy it in Franklin. We get a 3% excise tax on that. It goes
Shop
into
local.
the pot. No pun intended. Goes into the pot.
It was intended.
It wasn't. Yeah. It just rolled off the tongue. So I say this to try to lighten up the mood about, you know, these numbers. Those are hard. Those are really hard, and some judicious priorities are going to have to be made. Channeling my inner Jeff Nutting, we have to focus on the quality of facilities, because the longer we delay these things, the more expensive those projects are going to be. And I can already assure you, as you would all know, the costs that the council authorized for borrowing in 2020, those are at least 25% higher now. And I have baked into the model those 25% increases on those projects. And I bet you those costs will still be higher than that, particularly with building remodeling going on in this market right now with the supply chain problems and all the other issues. So we have some huge challenges here. And then just to kind of round things out, things that are not included in this model: costs associated with the police station or the Davis Thayer building. With whatever people decide, if the municipal government is going to do something on Davis Thayer, that's a whole nother whopper of a cost that probably can't get absorbed in here. Additional strategic investments in the Franklin Public Schools. We've heard lots of ideas for years. There's nothing added in here about additional personnel, additional departments, additional programs, additional athletics. There's nothing in here that says we're going to get more of something. This does not include any public infrastructure investments of roads, sidewalks, parking lots, trails, or green energy commitments. This does not include the $500,000 to $1 million in annual capital needs that the Capital Committee, and I give them a lot of credit with Councilor Pellegrini, Councilor Creamer-Ledger, Councilor everybody, saying we don't want annual costs of curriculum and public safety gear to be an annual appropriation. We want those in, right? Technology. We don't even talk about technology, but I'm sure if Tim was here, he would say Chromebooks, laptop, all sorts of infrastructure. This doesn't even include any new investments in transportation. There's just nothing else. I think you get the point. So that's really the model, Mr. Chairman. Those are the baseline assumptions for the expenditures. I'll stop there and see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Jamie. Questions from the committee? Dave.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Jamie. This is, well, thank you for, first of all, putting all this information together. It's, numbers are truly harrowing at the bottom there, to say the least. And so let me ask the obvious question, just to, so we're all on the same page and to ensure that the obvious question gets asked. If nothing happens, what happens? Are we just going to see cuts across the board? And you said these predictions don't even factor in investments that we would like to see. This is just maintaining, right? So if nothing changes, what's going to happen?
Camera got me taking a sip of the water. So ultimately, number one, if nothing happens, as I wrote at the end of my memo, I think one of the things is we still have to realize that each year you're making a 2.5% commitment to various accounts and to various departments. And those investments have a real impact in the community. And so one option is, I put it on the menu here, if the town decides to live within its means of the 2.5% level, we're still going to try to do economic development stuff. We'll try to bring in new revenues. I mean, we'll be creative and do different things as we always have, right? But ultimately, I do believe still the quality of life and the service delivery in this town are probably as best as you can find in the United States, and I really mean that. You look around in the news and you see what's going on around the rest of the country, world, we got it really good here. And so when people say those questions to me, I have to say, in a positive way, I still think this town is in excellent shape with what it has. Obviously, going through the rest of the decade, we have a lot of things we want, and the municipal part as well as the school part, right? I think I've said in the budget memos before, in the particular relation to the school district, at a $1.8 million or $2 million annual increase, in addition to potentially things like state grants and other revenue sources like the out-of-district placement, some of the expense relief, in addition to the slideshow that the superintendent and school business administrator put up at the budget hearings this year, put out a enrollment-based reduction slideshow of like 10 or 15 slides long. You know, enrollment-based reductions, they've been doing that for 15 years, right? And so ultimately, while that is that is jobs that are lost, that is there, but the student ratio has come down. So in some ways, the schools have been balancing their budget for the last 14 years basically because of the declining enrollment. So in some ways, the footprint is shrinking. And so I think over the last 15 years, the irony is that the schools have gotten better. So in some ways, I think at some point, we have to kind of say, like, where are those lanes in the road? I don't know exactly. I'm not the magician that can literally point that all out perfectly. I think that's a question that the community now has to answer. They have to answer some of those questions of, do we have enough money? Yes, no. If not, what are those investments that we need to see? And I do think that down the line with the tri-county vote, I think that's obviously one of the big issues. I think the MEC will be able to get by, and the regional dispatch will figure that out slowly but surely. Obviously it's a year-to-year thing, Dave, right? I'm only crystal balling this out in a model, but the town still has been very innovative over the years. We've changed a lot of paradigms. I know the fire and police departments get a lot of that glory, as they should, but so is the DPW, so is the schools. And so has every department, has been creative year by year to reduce costs and to find new ways to deliver services at an elite level. And so I think this is going to be a big question for the community in terms of answering that question of where they move forward. Like, where are those lines in the sand that we are not willing to cross? So I can't really fully answer like what happens, and I don't think it's right for me to assume that we're just automatically cutting programs and laying people off. Because ultimately this year, if there were 22 positions that were reduced in the school department, 16 of those positions were due to declining enrollment. And I'm not saying I want anybody to be reduced at all, okay? But I think over the question and through the community discussions this year and seeing the engagement, this is why all these folks are here. And I think this is a question the community at large is going to have to answer, is what are your values in terms of moving through the rest of the decade to avoid 6 layoffs, 22 layoffs, or maybe it's adding positions too, maybe from the federal stimulus money. I think it's a question that we're all going to have to come together to try to answer.
Thank you very much, and if I may just a follow-up while we're here. So, thank you for expounding on that. And correct me if I'm wrong with this assumption. So as we get more and more into the red, as you're showing with with these numbers here, it's not just the schools, but also DPW, police, fire, library. Our capacity to get creative shrinks more and more and more, and the ability for things to be moved around and the necessity for all town departments really to reassess the level of services, I assume, also becomes greater and greater. And as again we get more and more into the red, and the pot shrinks and shrinks relative to how costs increase. Correct?
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Any other questions from?
Winky, what you doing, bub? You want me to move the blanket? Yeah. Oh.
Jamie, just before I go to the next question, just touch on the new growth dilemma. In other words, what people, a lot of the people here may not understand that over the past 20 years has been a valuable finance or revenue source for the community. Maybe you can just speak to what's happened to that.
Sure. With new growth, so new growth are unanticipated revenues based on property values that were not anticipated the previous fiscal year. So a good example would be somebody at their house does a kitchen remodel and installs a deck on their back porch. When we do the tax rate, we're delayed a year. This is the way municipal finance works, and I'm sorry, I don't want to get into a big municipal finance seminar. I know it's very boring, but ultimately, it's hard to explain without getting into some ways. But ultimately, if somebody does a renovation to a commercial property or their house, and the evaluation is a year or two old, and the assessors go to appraise that property, and the building permits come through, and there's a $50,000 renovation to a home. Well, that property is now worth $50,000 more than it was before that renovation. In the middle of the year, we capture that revenue in real time, and ultimately that's your new growth. And I'm synthesizing this, Mr. Chairman, to make it as easy and as quick as possible. So obviously you can imagine with interest rates being high, supply chain issues that are going on, the project across the street that I understand many people aren't fond of, but that project would have already been online by now if it was not for the supply chain problems, the cost increases of materials, and et cetera. But development in Franklin and improvement in properties, commercial properties like 210 Grove Street, or some of the cannabis facilities on Grove Street, or even some of the businesses downtown, right? To the Bamboo House parcel that's there, Franklin Nutrition, those parcels. All of those get captured by our appraisers and our assessors, Kevin Doyle. Kevin Doyle's the rainmaker, just to give him a plug, the principal assessor. Kevin is our rainmaker. Yes, Cole, he is our rainmaker. He brings in revenue. His team goes out and captures this. If we don't have incredible assessors and an incredible board of assessors, and that number plummets, or if we become too NIMBY and we just don't want anything anywhere, that number goes way down and your tax levy goes down and cuts come. So ultimately, the properties across the street used to be vacant, Fico's and Keegan's used to be vacant, dilapidated properties. Those are now getting captured in our property tax levy that's now going up 2.5%. If you drive down Grove Street, 210 Grove Street was an old dilapidated facility. Got renovated by Marcus Partners, who, by the way, sold their profile yesterday for $176 million. I wish that was in here, but they get to, it's private sector. They get that money. But we still get a lot of revenue off that gets into our tax base. And so with interest rates, supply chain problems, cost and materials, inflation going up, I don't think I need to speak to most homeowners. People are starting to pull back a lot, right? There's more risk in the marketplace. People are deciding they can wait another few years for that renovation. The contractor's too much. Hey, let's save the money. We'll put it on pause. That's now starting to have an impact in our budget, which is why I kept that revenue source assumption across the board at 1.1 million. That might even be optimistic. And we've had some great podcasts on new growth. So you can, Steve, Mel, Kobe, Brad Chafee, we've had developers on who have been open about this stuff, which has been awesome. But new growth, we had record-breaking new growth right prior to COVID. And even the COVID year, new growth broke the record. Why? Because all those projects had financing. The banks had those projects financed. They already had the contractors on site. They had the materials. Those projects kept going. We've seen that dry up. And if you look at a planning board agenda recently, there's a lot less on those agendas, which is telling you fewer applications, right? So when you see fewer applications at the planning board and the meetings are shorter, that's usually a bad sign for the tax levy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that was my point. Just we've been fortunate over the last 25 years. But now things are slowing down. Not a lot of land available in town. And in fact, I think, if I'm correct, last year, single-family homes, new single-family homes in Franklin were 10 that were built. That's not very many.
And in the 90s, you were averaging 200 plus.
200 plus. And last year there were 10. So just to put it into perspective. Okay, questions? Councilor Hamlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through the chair, I just want to take a moment to thank the chair for his opening remarks. I agree with them 100%. Thank you, Jamie, for putting this together. I was going to ask you to explain new growth.
You can explain it. You're pretty good at it. No.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for asking that question. Just a point of clarity here, just for people at home, or like you have all the red numbers. This is not at the bottom. This is not cumulative, right? This is every year you predict this is going to be our deficit.
That's correct.
Is that correct? That's correct, right?
Based on the assumptions.
Right, so
modeled.
really, in 2029, we'll be like 11 million or something in the hole, something like that, right?
Could be a lot worse.
Could be a lot worse, yeah. And also the, just remind me, did you have the increase in supplies for like the DPW at 2.5%? Because that's like way low.
It is way low, but it is
Everybody's
way
like
low.
going, yeah, like Brutus, right?
It is way low, but
Yeah.
we also know that on an annual basis, Brutus is extremely creative to try to offset those. So one contract maybe go up 6%, but then you try to work within the marketplace, like trash rates, right? We haven't had a trash rate increase in years, right? Well, because they're creative in how they use their money. So I think, it is low for sure, and I think he would agree with that.
Would you agree with that, Brutus?
Yeah, Brutus Kennereggi, DPW Director. Obviously, and I think particularly last 2 years, I think we saw, Public Works, over 60% of our budget is expenses. And, on a $6 million expense budget, that's fuel-driven and chemical-driven. Because, that's just the things that we have to do. Salt, has gone up. It's just incredible. So we try to deal with it.
Right. I know you do. Thank you for all your work.
Thank
Hard
you.
work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilor Hamblin. Dave?
Thank you, through the chair. And, Jamie, thank you so much for putting all this together. As I'm kind of doing my homework for this meeting, really kind of going back so many years, take a look at the budget narratives over the past. One of the things, a line that kind of kept coming up in a number of years was, balancing the budgets by draining the stabilization funds in a number of years. And also talking about how that's not a long-term solution and policies need to be met. I know in here we've talked about the not touching the stabilization fund and also how that's so critical to get that AAA bond rating. Just be able to elaborate on exactly the benefit that the town of Franklin's receiving by having that stabilization fund and not drawing upon it like they have in the past.
Sure, that's a phenomenal question. Ultimately, if the town was not to maintain, somebody pointed out to me today, like the federal government that got downgraded, I think yesterday, we're AAA and they're not. But if you really look at that cost, to your question, Dave, it's a great question. When you look at the interest line item in account 750, and if you're a Tri-County and you're evaluating a 4.25% interest rate, we would say, I think Kerry and Chris would also agree, probably 4%. If you go down to a AA or AA plus, that number is now tripling because you're getting a 5%, you're getting a 5.25%, you're getting 6% interest, whatever that is. Maintaining, and I would say that for both the schools as well as the town, I think it was the revolving fund surplus that's in there, while certainly I think some would say maybe a dink and a dunk every once in a while might help out the budget, but ultimately there's a surplus there that is a safety net for the school district that is critical. And I would argue that none of the reserves in any of our stabilization accounts or revolving fund accounts should be tapped into because that AAA bond rating, you're susceptible to a downgrade every single time we go out to borrow money because we have to do a rating agency's call. We have to do a full review. It's hours of work for the finance director and treasurer collector and myself to go through all that. We kind of have to do the best we can to put on a good show. And the Budget Stabilization Account and the Community Preservation Act were two things, and our reserves in general. General stabilization, budget stabilization, even the school revolving accounts, as well as the fire truck stabilization. By the way, there's also for the public, we have a stabilization account that we put money into every year for the fields in town. So every 10 or 15 years when the fields need to be rebuilt, we have a piggy bank essentially. All of those points add up to the rating agencies having the highest level of confidence in our fiscal policies, fiscal management, and probably most important, discipline. The key factor a couple years ago was the Community Preservation Act. and the stormwater utility. Why? It showed the rating agencies that the elected officials had the confidence and trust of the public to be able to do a utility for stormwater, and it also showed the voters of the community were willing to raise taxes for a purpose. Those are huge bonus points when you're going to rating agencies. So just for the public, if you go to the budget website on the town, all those ratings reports are there. People can go read them. I think that's probably where you were coming from, Dave. And so it's really, I think, as we still live in a very turbulent world, I think it's really critical to make sure that we maintain that, because you're just going to jack up this line item here, and that's just going to make cuts everywhere else.
No, thank you, and that's really kind of exactly it too, to say, you know, it's not, I know also in the packet, and this is available for everybody too, you know, you're right, while it might feel like a rainy day today, it's not, but even beyond that, even if it were a rainy day, there's still such a substantial cost to drawing upon that in the long term, it's just not a feasible or sustainable option.
It's not, and I think, Mr. Chairman, I think maybe a couple of them may be able to speak to this, they were around back then, happened in '07, right? You guys passed, the one override that was passed was the year before the recession. So all that progress on that override ended up actually getting wiped away in the recession a year later. But if you had not passed that override, that recession would have been that much worse. Right? And we're still, today, and if Jeff were here, he would back me up on this, we are still trying to get back to where we were from that recession. Hence the messaging this year on like the senior center van that was years ago lost, dealing with the arguments from the police department that the chief had mentioned, and so forth and so on. We're still trying to pick up the pieces to get back the capacity that was lost from 2008, 15 years later. So it is true. It feels rainy, but it's not. Well, maybe this summer was rainy, but.
Thank you very much.
I'll say Dave. Councilor Chandler?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Hi, Jamie. Thank you very much. Very informative. So we just talked about the 5-year forecast, obviously. So with the $1 million growth and the 2.5%, would I'll just use as an example, the police, the fire, the DPW, would they be able to keep all their people for the next 5 years with that?
That's another awesome question. So this model does not add any new personnel in any department, but it maintains the personnel that was approved in the FY24 budget. So it does include in here the same level of personnel that we have today.
So for the next 5 years, I'm getting my streets plowed, policeman's gonna show up at my door.
That's right.
If I need an ambulance, it's coming.
That's correct.
Okay. And now I just have to add the school into this, excuse me, everybody. So with their 2.5, but they got a 4% raise. So they're gonna be down 900,000 to $1 million right off the bat. Okay, so they're gonna need that much more money.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So I think that's all worked out, by the school committee and the superintendent. I don't know the numbers, to be honest with you, exactly, but I think if you look at history, the way they've been able to get past that is from the declining enrollment decreases, right? I mean, if you look at the numbers, and I don't know it off the top of my head, the superintendent would probably know, but ultimately there is a savings on the expense side and an obligation that you don't have to pay when there's a declining enrollment and those costs are shed. And ultimately, that's how you're getting to your $3 million increase. So they're able to fund those contracts, I would suspect. And I think one thing that's a big positive, I think we all agree that the teacher salaries are underpaid. We all agree that we need to be more competitive. We all agree recruitment and retention. Well, in the teacher contract, there's been an 8% increase over the last 2 years. So I'd like to think that that's a really big positive for the district in the sense that, like Foxborough, for example, I think over the last 2 years has gotten a 3% increase in their teacher unit, maybe 4. Well, now we're making a 4% inroad, right, into that because those costs have gone up, the salaries have gone up, and so I don't know if there's been an ROI on that. I'm sure nobody has the time to do this because I don't, and I'm sure we're all so exhausted and overwhelmed, but I'm guessing, Councilor Chandler, that's likely how those contracts have been met.
Okay. So for the next 5 years, if we hit some rough patches, I'm just saying if we didn't need an override, we would still get those services.
Yeah, absolutely. This model is completely based off the FY '24 budget. All those services that you mentioned, including the schools, would stay there as is.
And this model, I mean, I've said this before, as you all know, 100 years ago, 5 years from now would have been the Great Depression.
Right.
So we really don't know what's going to happen.
We don't.
So, just to bring that up. But,
Thanks.
I know. No, but I'm just getting at that point, you know.
You know, you could be a town manager. Right? That's what we do. Is think about
I don't
the
want
worst
to forecast
scenarios.
that. All right. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jamie. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilor Chandler. Councilor Frangillo, you have your hand up?
Yeah, thank you. This is fantastic. Thank you for all the work you put into this. Throughout the presentation, I had 3 things stand out that perhaps didn't feel fully covered by what we went through, 2 of which were already touched upon, but I'll name them again. One being new growth, and I apologize for being caught shaking my head on the Kevin Doyle. That is in no way to disrespect Kevin Doyle and the assessors who do absolutely incredible work and are very important. But they identify new growth that's been completed. Right. They don't allow it or encourage it to be made. The rainmakers in that case are those who make the decision to encourage and allow for the types of development that we want in town. So if you want to see new growth, then there are decisions that can be made to encourage that new growth. On the expense side, so that's on the revenue side. On the expense side, yeah, the other one that was brought up was DPW. That did stand out as the it was stated 60% of your budget is supplies.
Yeah, expenses. And we're the other thing is we're the biggest budget besides the school.
Yeah.
So it's significant.
Second biggest budget, 60% is supplies. What's personnel as a rough percentage of most other?
I think the police would be like 97%. The fire is probably 90+%. Once you get past police, fire, DPW, and facilities, we're getting off track here. Yeah. When you're talking about assessors, comptrollers, planning, all that stuff also usually has, just so the public's aware, a lot of those departments have statutory requirements to them too. If people don't want the Board of Health, you just can't get rid of it. You have to have certain things to do certain things, okay? So I just, some of these things are not discretionary, and I just, they look like easy picking sometimes, but they're not. So you really those 4 budgets, and I think Mike's budget is probably similar to Brutus's. His is overwhelmingly expenses from electricity, gas, parts, facility upgrades, all that.
That was the other one I had identified, right? So what's scary about the two, right? It's easier to, not easy, but easier to ensure a 2.5% increase amongst personnel. It's much, much harder. This is just hammering home a point that's already been made, but much, much harder to ensure a 2.5% increase amongst supplies. 2021 annual inflation rate was 7%. 2022 was 6.5%. 2023 so far has been 3%. All of those are, for the most part, material supplies being above 2.5%. So that's a scary assumption to be made. It could be worse. And the other piece amongst that is what's not included, as you pointed out. It's just general capital and keeping up with our capital expenses. Can you give us an early preview of roughly public infrastructure projects that should be done now, the cost of those that you would like to get done?
Well, on the 16th, I'll be coming a little more in depth, but we just did our road evaluation thing, and it came back, and we're $40 million in the hole in that. And what we've shown, I think, one thing with Public Works is I have a plan for everything, and it's been in place for a long time. And, last time we did it, we said our road ratings were gonna go down. They have, because even though the council and we've gotten more money, it's still not enough. So eventually they are going downhill, and it's just happening.
Right, so that's another thing that's not being captured, and I do recommend that everyone tune into the more thorough presentation. But that's your, us taking care of the roads and the pipes and sewers and water. Just on roads alone, we're already 40 million in the hole. Those numbers are all things that, at least in the past few years, have been growing faster than 2.5%. Just wanted to make sure the third thing that isn't fully captured in this, and this is really the conversation for everyone to have, is, you touch upon it a little, but the key part of all of this is the actual quality of service that we're delivering. And part of it is understanding how we feel about the quality of service that we're currently delivering, and where we want to potentially be aspirationally, but also the impact that falling behind in our expenses has on quality. You mentioned that the schools have never been better. I don't actually, I don't know all the metrics off the top of my head. That seems like a question that's important to be answering. And in a piece of me, just knowing programs that have been cut since I've been in school, it seems hard to believe that would be the case. But at least it's something that, so much love. Anyway, those are the three pieces. I really do appreciate you walking us through this all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Frangillo. Any other committee people? I have a question for our police chief. Actually, it's for both police chief and fire chief, but I'll do the police first. Same question for both. Could you explain the main cost drivers in your expense budget, to Kobe's point, talking about expenses here?
TJ Lynch, Chief of Police. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, so our expense budget is completely different than Brutus. All right, so 4.8 of a 6.9 million budget, or 4.8 of every budget for the last 3 years, is what our expense budget is. The other 95.2 is all salary. Of that, 99% is contractually driven. Can't change it without changing the contract. You gotta pay. You gotta pay. All of my staff are union, with the exception of my command staff and 2 civilians. 7 people out of 54. So that 4.8 represents maintenance contracts for software. We're just not, so it's $338,000 of a $6.9 million budget. That's my expense budget. You can't squeeze anything more out of us. Really can't. It's contracts for maintenance agreements for software, things like that. Tuition reimbursement for the officers that go to school. It represents the ammunition we use for training. It's training tuition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not an awful lot. Now, one of the things that we've been talking about through these last budget processes for the operations budget was taking what we typically and have historically had in capital and putting it into our expense account. And if you're going to take those things historically, and I don't disagree with it. I don't disagree that these are expenses that we ask for every single year. And you're talking, cruisers. You're talking soft body armor bulletproof vests. You're talking some technology in the desktop computers, things like that. And then you're talking about our TASER lease program. All items that we have to have. If you were to take all of those and put them into the operations budget on the expense side, it's going to be anywhere from $450,000 to $525,000, depending on how many cruisers we need in a particular year, how many bulletproof vests are up for their 5-year renewal, because they do expire after 5 years. Not letting an officer walk around with a vest that is expired. It needs to stop bullets. That's what it's for. The tasers are a less lethal option that we have, that if we didn't have, we would end up having to go to a baton, which does a lot more damage than the taser. It saves injuries on suspect, saves injuries on the officers, etc. So all I'm saying is just you're gonna more than double the current expense account, taking it out of capital and putting it to operations, and it's just gonna add to that deficit. You know, you're talking two different pots of money. Where does the capital come from? It comes from all of the remaining funds that are not expended by departments at the end of the fiscal year. So that's free cash, and that's where we're getting those items. We, you know, and typically we understand that there's a small pool of free cash. So to go to your point, I agree that these are regular items that we buy, and if you actually put them into the expense account of our operation budget, I wouldn't have to worry about the off chance that maybe I start the year with all my people and end the year with all of my employees. Same thing with DPW, same thing with fire, and there isn't much left in free cash, which means now I might not get all 5 or 6 cruises that I'm asking for, or we don't end up getting some of the other items that we're looking for. But that would, you know, so like I said, we have run 4.8, it'll probably remain the same. When our other side of the house goes up, the operation side goes up as well. And so we're running at about 5%. I don't see it really increasing. This would be a huge difference if we were to now throw $500,000 and add it to the $338,000 budget that we have for fiscal '24.
Okay. We talk about, in Jamie's forecast, he's looking 2.5%. And to Brutus's point earlier, and to School Committee Callahan's point, that every cost of supply chain, you name it, is going this way. And it's increasing at a rate higher than 2.5%. Where does that money come from to give you those same things?
I mean, would it be more difficult? Are things going to go up? Sure.
Are there any efficiencies that can be garnered in your expense side of the budget? You did such a great job with the payroll side a few years ago.
Yeah.
Just looking for you to do a similar thing on the expense side?
It's just, the problem is it's so small as it is now, there's not much I can end up doing with it. A matter of fact, it was at 312, went down to 296, then went up to, 312. I mean, basically year after, each year is different. How many people are putting in to go to school for tuition reimbursement? Do we have leftover ammo because maybe one of the trainings ended up getting canceled? I mean, we're penciling real sharp to make sure that, we need what we need. And in the end, if we have something that we really like and we can't end up basically, I didn't go to the town and say, hey, we could really use a Polaris UTV because we've had a number of incidents that have occurred in different areas that we just couldn't get to very easily. We probably needed it for the longest time. We have the Franklin State Forest, which is one of the only places you can ride a dirt bike legally in the state of Massachusetts. You've got the SNET Trail, you have this and that. So we didn't ask. We bought the money out of federal asset forfeiture funds, which is the money that we receive because I have an officer who works pretty much about 40 hours a week with Homeland Security investigations. This is drug money that was taken from drug dealers.
Wow.
I've bought a lot of equipment. I never really talk about it because, it's just we do what we do and we get things done. And we've spent plenty of money on things that we either would like to have or need, but cannot or don't feel comfortable asking the town for it because we know that it's going to come out of capital, and capital is so big, and every year everybody's asking for so much. So we end up using that, when we can, and we don't go and ask for something that we don't think we're going to be able to get. And if we don't have the asset forfeiture money to do it, but this is one-time funds, just like the town council and all the other financial people. You don't take one-time revenue and inject it into using it for salaries. And as a matter of fact, we can't. The federal government would not allow that. You can only use it for training, equipment, and basically investigative overtime. And that's pretty much what we use it for. So if anyone's wondering where the UTV came from, that's the money where it came from. And I am not saying sorry to the drug dealers that we basically helped to put it behind bars. These are your big ones. These are your distributors. The reason we have them attached to that is, our jurisdiction is here. We're talking about big fish that provide smaller fish that provide even smaller fish that make those narcotics into Franklin. It's part of our entire plan of how we're gonna end up trying to save, do the best we can to prevent people from getting addicted to opioids. And then once they are, obviously, we use our clinicians and we use every other resource we can to try to get them the help that we need. And this is another part to that, and we want to use that money. And by the way, the state's trying to make it so that they limit some of these, our ability, with these funds. I don't know why, we're fighting hard, I hope it's not. Ben Franklin was bought with federal asset forfeiture money. Another one never went to the town and asked for it.
No, you did not.
No, we did not. So in answer to your question, sir, I don't think that we can really reduce anything more, and I can't depend on always getting that money in. Although, Timmy Nagel, who's the detective, works it, does a great job, and we, have some funding come in, but I don't know when it's coming. I don't know how often it's going to come. It didn't during COVID. We didn't get much because the federal courts were shut down, just like the state courts and everything else. So,
Thank you, Chief.
you're welcome.
Chief McLaughlin,
Chairman.
same question.
Yeah.
Explain the main cost drivers in your expense budget.
Jim McLaughlin, Fire Chief. So from fiscal year 19 to 24, the fire department's expense budget is between 8 and 9%. For FY 24, our expense budget is roughly $650,000. 500 of that is basically 5 major line items on the whole expense budget. Our first and highest is vehicle maintenance. Most of our vehicles have to get serviced outside of DPW. You have to be they don't handle the pumps, the ladders, and what have you. We have to send out for that. That's the biggest cost driver in our expense budget. The good news is, through the support of many of you people here, we are in great shape right now with our frontline apparatus. We're going to be in better shape in 25 with that ladder truck. But we're already seeing with those 21 engines put in service, with these 2 ambulances put in service, the number slightly came down this year from last fiscal year for that cost. So it's a big cost, but we've got a good handle on it, and based on everything we've gotten from this council and the Finance Committee, we're going to be in good shape in the next 3 to 5 years in that regard. Our second is our health supplies, EMS supplies. The unfortunate thing with health supplies is post-COVID, those supplies prices really went high. But we also have that opioid agreement that we've got, that's going to allow us throughout the next 10 years to get Narcan, get other EMS supplies that we don't have to use in that budget now, based on that settlement, that to the best of my knowledge is going to be in 10 years. So that's going to help us keep that in check over that course of time. Then we have tuition reimbursement. That's a collective bargaining agreement that we promote. We want our firefighters to go get education. And tuition, and then the contractual services, just like the police department, we have a line item for outside vendors that come in and do inspections of equipment, our generators, our ladders, all of our equipment. They come in and service that, so that's a major line item. And the last one is our EMS vendor, our ambulance transport vendor. That's our third-party billing company, and that number is our 5th highest line item. That's actually a line item we'd like to see to go up, because that vendor gets 2.9% of what we bring in for revenue. So in FY23, we brought in $2.2 million in the ambulance transport revenue, which was an increase of about $350,000 from last year. That's a percentage, and fortunately, that same vendor, we got a new 3-year contract. We actually got their price even lowered a little bit. So they're taking a little bit less than they were taking the last 5 years. So that's a number that goes up. We have to give the contractor more, but it's a percentage. That means we're bringing in more. So it's actually a good number to see go up, because that money goes into the revenue for the town. As far as what we can do, it's an opportunity for me to just, I'm very proud of it.
No new trucks. No more new
no
trucks.
new trucks. No, not 25. Well, we got a council meeting coming up. As far as expenses, just like the police chief said, we don't have much. It's 8%. But we do have that volunteer committee that the fire department put together a few years back. And we're proud to say that we've got up to about $1.8, $1.9 million from grants and from donations that we've got. This is not the chief of department, it's not the administrative team, it's everybody on the fire department. These folks, these men and women come in, do it on their own time, and they've become competitive, and we're getting a lot of money. We just got $600,000 this year in radios. We would have been in front of Capitol to get two or three more stages of portable radios. We don't have to do that now. So we just got $300,000 in training. I just bring it up. We just try to do our best.
Repeat the number, please.
We're just trying to do our part. We really are, and we're really proud of it, and we're going to continue to do it. And that helps offset the expense account, because just like what Chief Lynch said, we truly don't have that much room to work with on the expense side.
Repeat that grant number.
We're $1.8 million. We're coming on close to $2 million. So it's nice.
Thank you, Chief. Mr. Canareggi,
Mr. Chairman.
I know you answered part of it, but the same question. You have the biggest expense budget of the municipal part of the government. What are the main cost drivers in that expense budget?
The main cost drivers are supplies, bulk type things like fuel and salt that, you know, we don't have a lot of control of, that we have to deal with. That's the largest thing. And then you get into, like, you know, our asphalt costs when we go out doing potholes and stuff like that. And then the other big thing, it's so I think everybody understands at home, is vehicle costs. We have over 200, I think, 68 registered vehicles, yeah. And that's not even counting, you know, the backpack blowers and all the other stuff. So all the parts and everything and the oils and specialties that go along with that are just it's incredible. Tires have just gone up tremendously. So those are really the big things that we do. And the one thing I do like to say is that you know, with Public Works, we touch every department in town. You know, it doesn't matter if it's the library, the senior center, you know, we're maintaining that, the school department, we take care of all the grounds and stuff like that. So we're actually out hitting everybody at one way or the other.
Thank you, Bruce. Okay. Any other questions from the committee? Anyone in council chambers have a question?
I do.
Please.
All right.
Just come forward, name and address, please.
Sarah Catapano-Friedman from 73 South Street. Question, one thing we didn't touch on were the health care benefits and also the pension benefits. Mm-hmm. I know you're projecting a 2.5% increase on those, but that seems low when you're talking about health care costs and pension costs. So I'm seeing that, correct me if I'm wrong, as a potential place where we may end up owing a lot more money. I don't know what the increases have been over the last few years, percentage-wise, on those.
Through you, Mr. Chairman.
Doug mentioned 7%, but go ahead.
I did, yeah. So the model does assume 5% pension rate of growth in the pension, which is just right there, retirement and pension. This does actually. I should clarify one thing. It's a 5%. That does not include Mass Teacher Retirement System. So that does not include MTRS. Right. That is just Norfolk County. So it assumes a 5% there. And then health life insurance benefits right here is this is only the municipal cost. Okay, that assumes a 7% rate of growth there.
Okay.
And that's about an average over, say, the last 5 years or so. And the schools, I know, because we jointly work on healthcare through an insurance advisory committee together. And so they budget the exact same percentage. The school budget does pay for their own healthcare benefits. But when you add it all up, salaries and benefits between both the school department as well as the municipal department, you know, occupies probably 3/4 of the entire budget. Mm-hmm. And I think if my numbers are correct, Denise or Dave, you can correct me if I'm wrong, salaries and healthcare occupy about 85 to 80% of the entire school budget. That's probably pretty accurate, right?
I believe 88%.
88%. So healthcare is a $12 million, $13 million line item for the town every year. You know, it goes up 7%. Yeah. So you're correct in your analysis. It's a tough time, but it is another success story where we have the Insurance Advisory Committee. It's called an IAC. It's made up of union members of each department. Joe Corey comes on behalf of the schools. Donna shows up a bunch of times. Wendy usually comes a bunch of times too. And we all work together with the administration and the school administration with our consultants and our folks to try to get the best plan design. To be true, the real reason why this line item has not really killed the town is because of the health savings account program that we offered 4 or 5 years ago. It's become incredibly popular. It's lowered costs for the town and schools. It's also lowered premiums. And shockingly, 2/3 of the employees don't hit the deductible. So we offered a high deductible plan some years ago, and it's, you know, first couple of years people were tentative, right? But now it's the first question out of every member's, they ask every year is, can we keep the health savings account? So it's actually kind of also a success story, I think, of the paradigm shifts we try to do here year to year. So when you look at the numbers, yeah, it looks like a deficit, but every year we're still constantly innovating to try to do those things. So
it
sorry for the shameless plug, but she gave me a little bit of assistance.
It sounds like we're saving what we can on the healthcare and the pension.
Yeah.
And then those building funds that we don't have allotted in your budget for Jefferson, Remington, Parmenter, all that?
Those are in here.
They're in there, okay.
Parmenter is not.
Parmenter's not, okay.
Parmenter had an authorization in 2020 for $1 million for boilers. But I think, you know, we have to have I know the schools are entering into a facilities plan. I'm sorry to say this, but I'll just say it. It just doesn't make sense to go out and borrow 5, 6, 7 million to renovate Parmenter if we don't know what the future beholds for all of the schools. We have to at some point make that judicious decision. That's a lot of money to borrow, especially when Remington Jefferson is probably going to cost the same amount, right? So you're talking 10 to 15 million in borrowing, 4.5% interest. I've already spoke to it, but.
So the question is, without enough money, whether to close Parmenter
Right.
as a school.
That's their decision.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the facilities plan that I think are working, I think you guys voted like last month, right? I mean, at some point, I think we got to figure out as a community what the future of those issues are. I went through my fixed cost slide with the budget presentation. I mean, all of that just absorbs more money out of operations, right? Staff, people, healthcare. I mean, I hope one takeaway is everyone understands all of this is interrelated somehow. One decision that is impacted here affects a whole series of other ones downriver, and that's a great example of that there.
Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else in the council chambers? Please, just name and address, please.
Heather Sansucci, I'm at 1 Dartmouth Road. Hi.
A resident microphone adjuster. Thank you, Mr. Sherlock.
I knew I was eventually going to get up here and say something. I just wasn't sure what it was going to be. But this has been really good and really helpful. A couple things that I wanted to just question or just ask a little bit more about is that this entire budget that you have here, or not budget, forecast is just that. It's an assumption of costs, income, everything. So we don't really know. Obviously, nobody has a crystal ball. But one thing that stood out to me was on the page up a little bit more where you talk about debt exclusions. And then you talk about how, I think it's in year 27, and that is around the same year that you're discussing the tri-county funds. So we actually have an increase of, I think it's about 3 million that year because of the debt exclusions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to your point earlier,
If we pass. If we pass.
11 towns have to vote. I mean,
Yeah.
realistically, they're going to probably pass.
Vote.
And again, there's assumptions, right?
Yeah, that's
So
right.
this is assuming that it passes. What was I saying?
I apologize, sorry.
You get the
Yeah, I'm
pointer
just
now.
saying, yeah. the pointer
Some are
now.
coming off, some are going on.
Some are coming
That's
out.
what I'm saying,
apologize.
so to assume that we won't have enough money in 27, 28 to pay for Tri-County may not be necessarily true because of the creativity and wizardry that we're also very good at, and we may be able to find that money. And that's for maybe 5 years out from now. We really don't know the economic status of the world at
That's
that
right.
point in time. So I bring that up because there's so much conversation around, you know, everything. Geez. The other thing that we don't know about that keeps coming up is the hold harmless funds. In order for the state to change that rule, every community in the state would have to be impacted by that. So not only would Franklin have to take an $11 million hit, first of all, it would never happen overnight and not in year one. They would drag that out for 10 years, 20 years to be equitable, because you can't just do that. I mean, what would we do? We'd lose everything, right? So I think that it's important that while it's noted in the budget that there's a big chunk of hold harmless funds, may or may not be relevant to the 5-year plan. So that's an assumption just to, right? Or no?
Go
Through you,
ahead.
Mr. Chairman. So Heather's correct, and I, you know, nobody has a crystal ball at what Beacon Hill would do. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, and I'd be retired on an island in Hawaii, very rich, if I could predict what they were going to do. But you know, I worked in the state. I worked in the legislature for like 10 or 11 years. I worked 5 of those years as the chief of staff on the education committee. I was there in 2006 when they did the revision. Actually, the most significant revision they did to Chapter 70 was in 2006. Most people don't give that year a lot of credit, but they changed the entire. They basically created an aggregate wealth model, right? So previous to 2006, it was land values that determined Chapter 70. After 2006, it was based on land values and median income of a community, right? And the town of Sandwich at the time was really, really being hit hard because they had a campaign called Fair Share for Sandwich that was based around the fact that they were land rich, but they were a middle-class community. And so they changed the formula. And then there's a bunch of other you are correct. To change Chapter 70 is a Herculean effort. The Student Opportunity Act that passed in 2019, I can't imagine anytime soon the legislature is going to pick this back up again. That being said, not to go where Councilor Chandler's dystopian view would be in 29, but in all seriousness, the one caveat I would say to your point, while unlikely, we didn't anticipate a 14% out of district placement. We didn't anticipate 2020. We didn't anticipate inflation being the way it is. And as Jeff Nutting wrote for many years, and I wrote for many years, you know, it's just walking on thinner ice, right? So we can assume, and I think you're right, Heather. I think to change Chapter 70 and to get away from hold harmless is a very, very hard thing to do, and almost likely not to happen. However, being in the room in 2006 and watching how the deals got made and looking at the districts that were lower enrollment then versus spiking enrollment versus high income towns versus low income towns and the impacts of a Chapter 70 redistribution, the community has to be aware that the local contribution has to go up someday. Otherwise, the city of Boston has like a $45 million hold harmless thing. I mean, you know, think if they lost that. I mean, does the community want to be in a position where we get to the end of the decade and we maybe are not in a Great Depression, but the economy goes south like in 2008? I just said we're still picking up the pieces 10, 15 years later. And so the hold harmless piece, and I know Miriam spoke to this for years. I mean, she is, and the superintendents previous have talked about this for years, about that hold harmless number. The more it goes up, the harder it is for the local contribution to catch up to it, right? And someday, there very well could be a scenario at which they're not going to take the whole 14, 18, 5 million. Again, what if it's 10%? What if the redistribution means this? And then ultimately, the district is vulnerable to the fact that next year, or in FY25, the district is going to be 35% smaller than it was in 2008, and on the record for the town of Franklin, for 15 years, there has never been an attempt to increase the local contribution. That's probably not going to go over well on Beacon Hill. And if you're in a district with an increasing service demand, whether it's a gateway city, whether it's a larger city with higher costs, whether it's school building costs, or whether it's a district with increasing enrollment like Hopkinton or Needham right now, who are the inverse of us, those lawmakers will say, hey, wait a minute, why are you making so much hold harmless money? You know, let's work out a deal. And then all of a sudden, You show up one day and I say, well, the conference committee budget came out and it wasn't just $2,000 less than what it was. And then I'm up here saying, well, they changed the formula. They had to balance their budget. And I can assure you, some of the accounts that happen during a budget deficit on Beacon Hill, they go for the big. Education aid is usually put over to the side. Usually special ed circuit breaker, transportation, regional transportation, those ones take, you know, a huge hit usually right out of the gate because they're the most money to balance the budget, right? And so while Heather is 100% right, I can't as a manager ever say, like, we're good, we're safe. So I need people to understand that. Thank you.
So further assumptions there then that things could happen, we could be in a depression. I mean, a lot of things are going to happen all around this room and all around this country if we're in a depression. So I think that there's a bigger story there if we're going to anticipate
If we're in a
that.
depression, yeah.
It's a big problem.
Right. It's a big problem, right.
Some of the comments about some of the positions in this town, under your sections or under all the sections are just they're not discretionary, they're required positions. They can't, like you said, the health inspector. Same as in the schools, right?
That's right.
There's
Absolutely.
many positions that can't be changed.
Totally agree.
They are what they are, and I think it's important to note that. I know you also made some mention, I know you're eventually going to dive into other smaller committee meetings. I don't know what the plan is or what the schedule is. I hope maybe you'll discuss it at some point, just to understand what the plan is, because I know in the beginning you said you'd be diving deeper into each of these with each department. But a couple things that just stood out. The stabilization funds for the field you were talking about, I mean, think about using that for the bleachers, 300
Can't.
grand.
Well, you just can't.
No,
mean,
I know, and that's good, and that's part of the education
It
that
is.
needs to be, I need to understand. And the word override keeps being thrown around because of inflation. Just know that the community and the members in this community are also suffering from inflation-related situations and loss of jobs, et cetera. So to assume that everybody would be okay paying more money is not safe. So just another thought from a community member who has talked to a lot of people who don't want to pay more money in their taxes because they can't afford it. Not because they don't want better things or a wish list of things. It's that it's unaffordable at this time. So also another thing, when you go back to your groups and say, oh, we need more money, but how do we get it? Well, it just may not be out there right now. So keep that in mind. And then I know we heard from a few department heads, but it might be good to hear from the superintendent if he felt like speaking or not. I don't know if you guys had some specific things about
If they
the
have
schools.
questions.
Sure.
But that's all I wanted to say.
Questions, I mean,
Thanks.
Yeah.
Everyone's available
Okay.
for each other. Yeah.
Somebody, Denise?
If I may, through the chair.
Chair Spencer?
At a few of the school committee meetings, just to kind of touch on what Heather was saying, in regards to Chapter 70, I've brought up that through the Massachusetts Association of School Committees, they've brought up a few times now over the past few months that they will be reviewing the formula for FY27, because a lot of the state reps have been contacted by school committee members in those towns because they've seen that Franklin has such a high amount, and they're wondering why they have nothing, and Franklin, who is considered a wealthier town, is getting so much more state aid. So it might take 10, 20, 30 years, but it is coming, so it's just something to kind of think about, keep in the back of the mind.
So you're validating my comments.
Yes.
That's actually even more frightening.
Yeah.
Because I didn't realize, no, I really truly didn't realize.
It's a huge conversation piece.
I've
at
said
a lot
it
of-
jokingly before, Mayor Wu is our best friend.
Yeah.
Because the hold harmless will impact Boston huge, and the political force in Boston should at least be a strong voice. We have excellent representation ourselves, but, they obviously have more senators and reps, right? And so I think that, be friendly to Mayor Wu, too.
For sure. I'll get to you in a second, Dave. Somebody else in council chambers had their hand up over here. Please, come forward. Name and address, please.
Hi, Fabiana. 524 Coronation Drive. Thank you. Here we go.
You're great.
I have questions, because a lot of it, looking at the forecast, like you mentioned that that's what we anticipate, right? But like, I'm listening, and I'm feeling that like we are reacting more than anticipating, right? And my question is like, when would be the time, and if we would have the time to discuss other alternatives to incentivize new growth? Because we need more jobs, right? We need not investors, we need like local businesses that there's other avenues for growth. Like, and you said that this forecast does not mention green energy and technology. So I would like to know if that investment in green energy, for example, would be something that we should have done before and cannot wait.
So this is a great question. You did a great job. And I hope I get close to your answer. So when I say there's no investments in here in green energy, what I'm referring to are investments in our own infrastructure in town, like in our buildings or automobiles, in municipal expenses. The town doesn't have any money allocated in the budget anywhere to do like a business development investment, right? So where we're saying, how do we create jobs or how do we do that? Traditionally, that's the state of Massachusetts that does a lot of that investment. I know Councilor Frangillo can speak to a lot of this. I'm putting him completely on the spot, but he's a smart man who works on the committee who seriously, I'm being honest, has a better bird's eye view of clean energy than I would. In terms of job growth, right? In terms of investments in like local economies. But when I mention green energy in here, we've had comments from a lot of citizens saying we want to do a study to get the town of Franklin to a net zero status, for example. And I think most people in this room, and hopefully most would agree that that's a really great thing. We've got a great clean energy sector in Massachusetts. But I wasn't referencing any investments the town makes in terms of creating jobs or developing new growth. That said, I love your optimism of job growth and of new growth and what it takes to try to raise more revenue through development. I think Councilor Frangillo and I are both right. He did do a touche that the assessors do capture what's permitted. I still consider them a rainmaker, but I think his point was the planning board, ZBA, and Conservation Commission allow development to happen, and when residents come out and oppose everything, they feel like they need to mitigate that or not approve projects or maybe shrink projects, right? But ultimately, he's correct about that. I'm correct about the assessors. The ultimate rainmakers are really the businesses and residents of the town. If we want more growth in those areas, people who live and work in this community invest in it, including everybody here. I don't want to be the guy that says, go do a home improvement, go renovate your kitchen, or go buy a property across the street and go do a commercial industrial project. But I think what Councilor Fragile is getting to is the opposition to development is unquestionably a deterrent to raising revenue to be able to meet our expense goals for the schools and other departments. So I think that's what you were getting at, and I couldn't agree with you more. Generally, Franklin's known as a very business-friendly community, but I think as the town has changed, there's been a lot more opposition to a lot of things, right? And we all understand, I typically tell people, if you want to be obstructionist to a project, that's your right, but you will probably not win that. If you want to go to planning board, conservation, and ZBA and try to mitigate a project, traffic or whatever, then you're going to get that project. Both, we're going to get the revenue from that project, but also you're going to end up having a better project with traffic calming measures, better signage, trees, whatever the case may be. So I agree with you 100%. Kobe, I hope I kind of nailed kind of our comments back and forth, but I think ultimately you would agree.
I'm comfortable with it. Yeah.
Okay, good. So So I think people do need, I'll take the shot at this one, but people do need to be conscientious that when we go out and oppose development, that has an impact. You are completely right. That has a huge impact on what goes on.
Right, but I think that I'm also concerned about like not just stopping investors, because I think that what we want is like residents should be able to invest in their town and work here. So
Yep.
we want people that like earn money and invest in their town. So like not big developments, but like we want to be like, and I don't know if that's something that is, when we would have the opportunity to talk about that, and like if there's something that we.
It's a really, really great question that I don't have a great answer for. I would just mention that Glen Farmer Distillery, that's a local family that invested millions in that building, that has improved the value of that building, that have a lot of employees in that building. When we did the cannabis industry agreement, all of those agreements all had local job preferences in it, right? So they were hiring a majority. In Clay-Sandetta, most of their executive team all live in Franklin, bought houses here, renovated houses. So I think that gets to your point. I don't want to bore everybody for an hour. Maybe we can talk offline, and we can talk about some of the success stories that some of that is happening, and it's hard to cultivate, but we have cultivated some of that over the years.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, good job.
Dave?
Thank you very much, through the chair. First, also, thank you for everybody in the council chambers, everybody at home, and for the great questions and a lot of the comments. And I know, Jamie, you kind of mentioned some of the podcasts. There's a lot of great information, a lot of podcasts over on Franklin Matters that really kind of synthesizes a lot of the information, a lot of the work that's being done right now. If you ever want to jump on that and listen to that, usually in little like 30-minute bite-sized chunks. Because there's a lot of work to be done moving forward. One thing too, we kind of talk about forecasts. If I may just, to the superintendent, a quick question.
Didn't even see him back there. Like, where did he go?
I thought you were hiding back there.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. So I know a lot has been said about the enrollment-driven reductions within the budget over the past 15 years. What do the enrollment projections look like moving forward?
So you may recall we had a demographic study done by Jerry McKibben, a demographer who came in and did a demographic study in relation to the study of Davis Thayer at that time for the closure, but it also was used in some of our projections as we move forward. The enrollment forecast, just to be clear, I think I'll take an opportunity while I'm here to clarify a couple of things tonight as well, but ultimately in 22-23 at our elementary, he predicted we'd have 1,963 students. We have 2,056 students. We're a little bit higher than what he had projected. Now, he was using 2010 census data. We now have 2020, so I think it behooves us as a community to get the updated 2020. But going off, that's pretty accurate considering we went through a pandemic and to be that close. So we take these projections and have tried to build them out. I think it's important to note for the elementary, in 22-23, if we're at 2,056, if you look at his model, and I just did added where the discrepancy was to try to model out for the future years. 23-24, we see a decline. 24-25, it declines, but then by 25-26 at the elementary level, you're back at the numbers you have today at elementary. So I think it's important to note that because when we think about schools and we think about our levels, where we have 5 elementary schools in 2 years, if you have the numbers you have now, we just conducted a redistrict analysis where we talked about could we fit all of our students in a consolidation, and the answer was, the conclusion we came to was no at this time. If we're looking at the facilities assessment report that was done, you may recall the Kessel-Booz report. A lot of great information in here. I've pointed people to this. Some of the suggestions in there at the end are worth looking at. We are in the process as a district of looking at doing a comprehensive plan to assess our facilities. because the other conclusion of the, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to capture the
It's
whole
okay.
room. I'm in my teacher mode here. But ultimately, stay awake in the back. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is really try to build off of the redistricting analysis conclusion was we need more information about the big picture if we're going to be on board with any type of long-term change. And I think Jamie's point around really looking at that and then making decisions that make sense for our community regarding space and facilities would make sense, but we have to do that work and show that to our stakeholders and to the folks in this room. Wanted to just capture at the middle level as we look ahead. So if you think about the decline at the elementary and then where it starts to come up, those smaller classes start to move through. If you have a third grader and they hit middle school, when we look out into the next few years, the middle school numbers we're at 1,074. They will continue to decline, and in they continue to decline until you hit 2029. So 28, 29, you start to see that come back up at the middle level. And at the high school, you'll see that number decline through 2029. So that smaller group starts to move. We do see a shift. Just want to be accurate here. I'm sorry, 2028, the middle school starts to climb back up. So we're in 2020 for FY24. By 28, you'll see the middle school numbers come up. So within that time, part of the reason for a comprehensive plan, and it happens to be in conjunction with the town's master plan, we changed the name so there was no confusion on our end. Of what we're doing is we're trying to really look and assess our facilities at the same time. You can't just assess facilities mechanically, but you need to, because ultimately where we send our public, and in our case our students every day and our staff, we need to make sure those facilities are up to the standard that we expect in Franklin, which is a very good one. And someone as a resident, I certainly appreciate each of our departments and what they offer and the creativity and what they've done to provide not only the level of service, but our buildings and the facilities we have. But we have to take a close look as well. Just want to get on some of the notes. There's a lot of information tonight. We're also looking to put a long-range budget model together. The same sentiments that have been made around modeling you're basing it off of assumptions, but that's what budget modeling is. You're basing it off assumptions. So barring any major issue, we as a school plan to continue to look at how do we budget out. I want to clarify just a few points just to make sure that we're on the same page. This document I would point people to, it's on the website. It's the presentation that was done for the Finance Committee on May 10th, but I did share it again at School Committee during the budget hearings. It hits on a lot of information that was discussed about school, and it helps to kind of really illustrate where we're at and what we're faced with. We're a human business, right? So we teach kids, and in that case, you're thinking about we need adults to do that. So 77% of our budget is made up of salaries. You add another 9% for healthcare. That's basically the bulk of your budget, and then you start to look at those other areas. I want to just make sure I hit on the formula. Just to clear, Mr. Sherlock, just to talk that through. When we think about the money from the formula, if the formula was just done, just basic math, and it's in here, there's a slide on this that kind of shows the math problem. It was $18,040,481, and we received $29,038,841. So it's about $10,998,000. So $11 million is the number, just to be clear for the crowd, so we walk out with the accurate number from FY24. When we think about declining enrollment, we think about also when we factor in retirements, resignations, and not filling positions, it's not all related to cuts, but we try to look at who's retiring this year, and we try to be as fiscally responsible as possible when we look at our budget. And I think we've demonstrated that. I've been in that chair for over 15 hours this year to talk about the school budget for the right reasons. And I think because we're the largest cost driver with regard to budgets, it does make sense. I've advocated to just show where we land for comparables within the Hockomock League. because it's important to have context from within our town, but you also need to be thinking about where do we fall within other communities similar to ours, or who we aspire to be, or where we are currently. We had to make some tough decisions this year. The $700,000 helped us out tremendously to bring back key positions that, if not, we would have seen higher class sizes across the board in many of our areas. I think that's problematic. Recruitment and retention. I know we talked a little bit about teacher salaries and the increase. I know last year in July, I mentioned it at school committee, we had 117 vacancies that we were filling before the start of the school year. And we were able to really get down to a few that led into the fall. Some were key positions. I think back to science, our physics position, which led into the fall, because some positions are really difficult to find. So I think from a recruitment and retention standpoint, I'm not alone in that. I know my colleagues are also experiencing that in this room and from other industries. We're all trying to find, and I think if you work in a business, it's harder to find qualified employees across the board. So that's not a unique thing to the schools. The last thing I wanted to say was just my advocacy for schools is certainly not meant to fall on asking for money that lands on the backs of my colleagues in this room from the DPW, the fire, or the police, because ultimately I'm advocating for what I need to sustain the organization we have as the leader. It's my job to advocate for schools and for what kids need, but I recognize in the room we're facing some conversations that impact our entire town and our entire community. And I just say that as someone who's not only a superintendent, but I'm also a Franklin resident who's raising children here, who's benefited from the services that our schools provide, our fire, our police, and our DPW. So I say that with all sincerity, and I just hope I clarified every point that I had. I don't want to take too much more time, so thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Councilor Frangillo?
I will say, many of my questions for you were covered. I'm glad I didn't have to ask him. We just had to tell you to speak, and you went. If I could ask you, as best you can, we went through the whole town part of things, but the school part is the largest, but all we get to see is that top line assumption. So if you could, sorry, they're good.
I'm sorry.
If you could sort of, as comparable, right? What we walked through with expense assumptions was sort of like, here's where we can see 2.5%. Here's some things that we know are likely to be above. Without putting you on the spot too much, and maybe this is a later meeting, could you talk about it in that way? For example, I know that, it's my understanding that the personnel in schools were identified, and I think you touched upon this a little, to be particularly struggling relative to communities, and that was really hurting our ability to retain and recruit. And so we're trying to catch up in that past our 2.5% increase. So if you could sort of go through from the high perspective, sort of places where we know where we can be at level, and places where we know we're expecting to be above.
I think one thing I would say is we were, with the 12-mile radius comparable districts, at a time we were ranked 10th out of 12th in the surrounding areas with entry salary. And then on the top scale, we were 11th out of 12th. So I think trying to stay competitive today. I'm noticing also the feedback I get when people resign is they want to move closer to home. That's understandable. But there are reasons people leave for a variety of things. And we're seeing that through the pandemic when people started to have the opportunity to take a minute and work from home, and not take a minute in the sense of rest, but not commute. I think it changed people's perspective on this, and I think we've seen that. And Jamie and I have had this conversation as well. So I think trying to remain as competitive as possible is one piece of it. Balancing the budget, thinking about our student needs. As enrollment has declined, we've kept up with the classroom teachers that are in front of kids. We have a range. It's basically a worksheet and a math problem, and we try to be as transparent as possible with that, but stay within the ranges of what the school committee has expected that we would have class sizes be. For example, 18 to 22 kids, right, would fall into an elementary level class. That's where you would expect a range. There's research out there that shows having reasonable class sizes for a teacher is a huge factor in their ability to educate students. When you compound that with what we're still experiencing through the pandemic, we had a keynote at the Massachusetts Superintendent Institute, and he talked about just the impact on kids and where they're at. And I'm not someone I'm a parent as well, and I'm not harboring on the pandemic. I'm not saying this to sound woe is me, but the reality is the behavior in students today and the needs of students today have certainly increased. So as we have kept up with our enrollment to keep those class sizes in the right range, we're seeing increases in needs for EL, which is basically looking at your English language learners, your special education group. You're looking at increases to mental health needs, which is where we've seen some counseling increases across our levels, and nursing staff because of health plans and different compliance measures that are required for that. So we try to take those things into consideration as we build our budget. We have reduced over the years beyond just enrollment. When we think about our librarians that we've cut, those weren't directly related to students, but those were budget-driven decisions at that time. World languages, when we think about what we've had at elementary. So I say these as just historical to just round off the conversation that we have tried to keep up with enrollment-based decisions to reduce, but other areas of the budget still are impacted. So the goal, I'll be happy to answer more questions, but as I mentioned, a comprehensive school facilities plan, which analyzes our physical buildings, visioning and multi-year strategic planning for what we want for our educational system in Franklin, and a long-range plan to model out a budget based on the information that was shared tonight, and in cooperation with our town administrator to help us come together and look at the budgetary needs. And I know I would speak for all of our colleagues. It's when you mentioned the interrelatedness, and when one shifts, something else happens and it has an impact, and I think that's what I'm hearing. So I'll stop there.
Councilor Frangillo.
Yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, the other thing that just came up, and this one I don't expect for you to have now, but you touched upon it being sort of one of the items, is it would be helpful for us to see some of those performance-based metrics about how we're doing over time, but particularly how we're doing over time relative to our peers, right? What comes to mind is, SAT, MCAS, APs, and then the rankings, Boston Magazine, niche, like those.
Right, so we can certainly do that, and I think through the pandemic, the state gave relief on reporting scores for students. So we have some years where they weren't necessarily counted or reported on, so I think we have to get some data that will help support that. As far as the state testings, we do have AP, and we can still get other information that I don't have with me at this time, but upon return to school, it's part of our analysis and part of our metrics for monitoring our success moving forward with the plans we've been working on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Frangillo. There was one other hand back there, please. Come forward, name and address. People on Zoom, I know there's a couple of hands up. We will get to you in a moment. I just want to finish up with people in council chambers. Please.
Thank you. My name's Patty Dolan. I'm at 35 Town Line Road. And first, I want to just thank you for your willingness to engage with and educate the community. It's incredibly helpful, and it's also heartening to me to see how many people are really interested in learning. And to that point, I want to ask a question about revenues, and maybe it's a very basic question, I apologize, but what is the process for, and has it been considered, the single tax rate, and whether or not to look at increasing the commercial tax rate? And I know that has impacts and knock-ons with development and all of that. I'm not asking to debate pros and cons. I'm just curious as to if it's been considered or what the forum would be for that discussion. Thank you.
Through Mr. Chairman, so that's it's evaluated every year in December. The tax rate by state law, all of our financial cycle is essentially following state law, right? We don't make any of this up locally. And so the tax rate has to be set essentially right around just after Thanksgiving every year. And there's a series of resolutions and requirements under the law that, in this case, the council has to consider. And the single tax rate, or it's also called the dual tax rate, those tax rates are debated, discussed every year in December. That being said, if a town was truly going to consider a dual tax rate, and this comes up every year, you don't just do it that night, right? Like you don't just like, oh yeah, let's. I'm being serious because I hope I'm not sounding. You don't just like whip it out. You usually hire somebody to work with the Board of Assessors to see what that impact is. Because you're shifting residential burden onto businesses. So you never come out with more revenue. A dual split tax rate doesn't increase revenue. It just shifts the burden from one entity to the other. So essentially what you do is you cut taxes at the residential level, for example, and then you increase taxes on the businesses, and it doesn't actually mean that there's more revenue.
Why would you cut them at the residential level?
Because that's how you have a tax rate, say the tax rate's $13 per thousand for right now it's the same rate for both businesses, but you would do an analysis. The Board of Assessors are elected, and they do this with our assessing team, Kevin Doyle and his staff. I know, they are thank you, Coach. Thank you. They are the best. But you would say 13 per thousand for a resident, and you may drop that to $12 per thousand for a resident. But then you would say, we're going to increase it to $14 for a commercial rate, okay? Otherwise, you're just then doing an override. So if you're increasing taxes, well, I know that was I know a lot of people in the audience were waiting for this one slide, so I kept it up there while everybody's been talking, but you would eventually then just say, we're doing an override. Yeah. So it's kind of one of the things. You got it.
Please, just name and address, please.
Sure.
Thanks, Steve. Customer service.
Ken Ojuku, 73 South Street. A couple of things I just wanted to touch on. A couple of things we got today. One of them, and first off, thanks for all the information. It's really helpful to hear it and to actually walk through it as a group, so appreciate you allowing the community to be here. It's clear that that at least the forecast is projecting a deficit that could be relatively severe in a relatively short time. It's clear that we don't have a lot of ways to drive additional revenue in and help defray some of the impact of that deficit, potential impact of said deficits. It's also clear that from all of the departments, the majority of the spend does go to personnel. There is some expense costs potentially, expense savings possible, but the majority of this is going to be personnel. It's also clear that there are other variables that we just cannot plan for, whether it's the hold harmless funds or inflation or a Great Depression in 5 years. We have no idea. So ultimately, I think it's clear we need to figure out the next step seems to be understanding or just kind of developing a plan to figure out how to close at least the gaps that we've identified, if not, shoot for more if that's what makes the most sense. What I'm looking for now, or I think what would be very helpful, is just clarity on both what that process looks like and how we're going to communicate, particularly with the broader community, so that people can actually stay in the loop. It's clear that people care about this. It's unclear how we're going to stay in the loop, because this is a great educational, education and just update on where things are. But but how do we make sure that we keep it going?
I'll be happy to take a jump at this. My thought process with getting this joint budget subcommittee together again and starting this process was to just do that, start the process, try and have at least an informational meeting to try and give residents as much information as we possibly can. At this juncture, I would look for our town administrator and our superintendent of schools to be working on this 5-year forecast, as you can see, and getting more into the more specific pieces, and then come back to this committee with that information so that we all get an opportunity to hear what the needs are from the schools, to hear what the needs and/or wants, in both cases, needs and/or wants of the schools, the needs and/or wants of the police department, of the fire department, of the DPW, of the library, across the board. This and I said this at a council meeting, where this is not a process that's going to happen like that. It just doesn't happen like that. We need to gather information. And in fairness to the schools, they have a change in a business manager recently. So putting this information together may take a little longer than we initially thought, but we're not doing the community justice unless we do that homework. The school does the schools do the homework and the school part of the budget. The town administration does it on the town part of the budget. We come back to this committee because I truly believe this is the committee that's going to sell it to the council. Because you're hearing from all three committees, meaning the town council, schools, as well as the finance committee. But we will continue to meet on a somewhat regular basis. I'm not going to sit here and tell you we're going to meet every month, because that's just not going to happen, because we're not going to be able to get that enough information in 30-day time period. But we will meet again, and I'm thinking at this juncture, in October, we should have enough information to have another meeting of the Joint Budget Subcommittee that I ask everyone who's sitting here, everyone who's out on Zoom, please come to that meeting. Come to these meetings. This is where you're going to hear the information. This is where you're going to hear, well, if we do this, we may lose this service. Or if we do this, you may lose this expense or these pieces. So my plan is to do that. I do believe, and as I said, in fairness to the schools, there's been a little changeover, and we have a little changeover in finance on floor number 2 here at Town Hall, and they're reorganizing along with the schools. So it may take a little time to get this done, but we will have these meetings that you will be able to have input into the decisions that we will look at, and ultimately, if there's a recommendation to bring to the council, it will come from this Joint Budget Subcommittee. It won't just come from the schools, it won't just come from the council, it won't just come from the finance committee, it will come as one statement from this group of people, because we're going to be the ones digging into this and looking out for the next 5 years. I think somebody spoke to it very early on, speaking about, well, we need to look out. We can't just look at 1 year, and we can't. And as Jamie brought up on the slide, we're looking at a deficit over the next 5 years. How are we going to address that deficit? Well, let's first understand what that deficit is and what we would have to give up if we continue just like we are.
So, thank you, Chairman. Just to follow up, one of the things you said is that Administrator Hallen and the school would need to get together. It sounded to me like this is actually broader than the school, or are you saying that he would?
Oh, I'm saying it's the entire town.
So
it's the entire town.
Right. So it's all of the various services you probably need to be in that conversation.
Absolutely, and I've said this 100 times. We built this building, put the school administrative offices and the town administrative offices in the same building, and put the town administrator and the superintendent of schools back to back for a reason, and that's communication. And I look for those two people to work together along with their administrative teams and the town council as well as the school committee, working together over the next few months, putting together this forecast that we can sit here and dive into. And as I said, what are the wants? We need to know what the wants are as well as just the needs.
Yep.
So, and then we need to make those decisions. And that's how I look at the next few months. Jamie, anything you want to add to that?
Really quickly, I'd make a quick plug again, another step in this process, and I have the slide up, but is the meeting on August 16th. I committed to that in May. That's going to be a little different twist of information. That's going to be on the ethical rules, the Office of Campaign and Finance rules, that paid staff, elected officials, the town attorney will be here, as he is every meeting. But that, again, for a lot of people, I think, it's just another valuable information piece that I think everyone really, really needs to understand. I know I sent all of you an email a few weeks ago about another ethical incident in another community. And why are those important? Not only they're just bad, but also they tend to erode. If people don't follow the laws and we don't do them right, that tends to erode public confidence. And so it is an important meeting for people to show up to know what paid staff can do, what elected officials can and cannot do. We're actually very restricted in a lot of ways. This is not a traditional policy debate. And then I think I would only throw in, obviously leave it to the superintendent and the school business administrator, but then school gets back in session. None of you are going to be available for a month or two and settle in. And I think back in the fall, like October, hopefully have another one of these meetings. But then I think in earnest, it's going to take some months, probably after the election in November. Then there's a month or two of reorganization among the council and the school committee. Then there's committee assignments, right? And really, I think generally, I would say in my head, you're looking at January for like what's I don't want to say, what's the 5-year forecast of the needs and wants. The council and school committee are both going to have to kind of have their own procedures too in terms of how they gather input from principals about what the needs are, or department heads and what the needs are. I mean, it will take a little time. And as I've mentioned in some other meetings, I just have to say it again, and I need the council's support, and I think the superintendent needs the school committee's support. We're going to have to sacrifice some other stuff. This is a lot of work. It's a lot of time. I cannot underestimate this. Like, it is a lot of time and work. We're here. We'll do it. But we can't chase every rabbit down every rabbit hole of every complaint every citizen makes. We cannot do everything for everybody. And I know for a fact that the superintendent and I need the support in our administrative teams from the elected officials. We need your support to say to people, we're sorry, we can't do that right now. We can't evaluate it. To your point, there's clearly a need. There's clearly people engaged. We see the deficits. This takes real evaluation and planning for my treasurer collector and finance director. We have a new school business administrator who just got here a month ago. He's still logging into Munis, right? There's just a lot of time and effort that goes into this. We can do it, but it's going to take a little time, and it's going to take some resistance to say to other people, we just can't do your project. We just can't do your thing. We just don't have the time. Lucas and I probably worked 60, 70, some 65-hour weeks. I mean, at some point, it's just too much. And if we're going to really try to dig into this, clearly the people out here are sacrificing their time because they're still here at 9:30 listening to all this. We need some space. I mean, I have to work with Brutus. He's got to go do a lot of cost evaluations, talk to contractors, figure out what the inflation rates might be. I mean, to cost this out and project it just takes a lot. So I'm looking at a January-ish timeline of saying maybe, hopefully a goal would be maybe by then, when the new council, all the new seats are filled, we can try to continue that along. But in the meantime, I think there's still a couple of other meetings to be had with other critical information to keep the education going. So Hope that kind of
And
answers
keep the
things.
momentum going.
Keep the momentum going.
Yeah, no, that's-
Within the community.
Yeah.
No, that's incredibly helpful. I just want to make sure that we're
Yep.
doing that, because, one of the things we've heard is that, Superintendent Giguere talked about the study that's ongoing. We've seen there's a time limit, time constraint that we're working with. And I think, so to your point, that's why there's some decisions that need to be made sooner rather than later. It's just a question of making sure that we are upfront about it, and people are aware, so we can actually make informed decisions, which
Absolutely.
I don't know that has been as successful historically.
And I would say, to your point, I think you make a great one about making decisive decisions. At some point, if we're going to model this out and look at it, like some point the line just has to be made. This is in, this is out, right? I mean, at some point we can't just keep thinking everything can happen. We have to make some decisive decisions. And I agree with that 100%.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Can I just make one comment? Sorry.
You
on that.
absolutely,
I'm holding back a
Nicole.
little.
Yeah.
Nicole.
Just a comment on where do we informing people. I just a little plug. I know on the finance committee we've done a really great job doing a lot of the deep dives into each department. And I know for myself, I could tell you probably what a lot of the wants and needs are from those deep dives. So I encourage people, don't just wait for this joint meeting. For all of us meet respectively in our own groups, and we talk about, not to diminish tonight, we talk about the same things. And so I think the more people hear it, the more it will be out in the community. And I can't read how many people have been on Zoom, and I'd like to say it's my angle, but I think it's my eyesight. But Franklin is a huge town, so relatively speaking, and I love seeing everybody here and everybody on Zoom, it's a small piece of the pie, right? And so I say, next meeting, bring a friend, right? Everyone bring a friend. I know when I go out to dinner with my kids' mom's friends, I'm talking about this stuff, and I get really animated about it, as some of you know. So I would encourage, this is such a great first step. I encourage you, bring a friend, bring two, talk about it constantly, to not lose that momentum, because that's when we get back to school. I know myself, I'm already dreading September, because I'm gonna, put my to-do list aside. So just keeping up that momentum is gonna be critical. And I think one of the key points is around, there isn't one solution. We heard Heather say an override might not be the best scenario for everybody because they can't afford it. They've lost their job, but then maybe new growth is not what people want either. So as Jamie points, we need to make decisions, and unfortunately you can't please everybody. And that's going to be tough, but I would say, yeah, bring a friend, keep talking about it, because I know we joke a lot in our finance meetings. Is anyone out there listening to us, right? Like, we just don't know. Like, here it's great seeing people in person, but if not everybody can come in person, which is fine. But we don't know who's watching on the TV and things like that. So it is nice to see the people. So I hope that there's, of course, more than that's out there watching on the TV or listening. But yeah, I would just say that, just to keep it going, spread the word, talk about it while you're having, drinks at Glen Farmer, right? So,
Thank you, Nicole.
Eating out in Franklin.
Donna Grady, you've had your hand up for a long time. Amy, could you unmute her?
Thank you. I'd like to thank the three committees as well for holding this joint meeting. Chairman, as you have noted, it is really, really important that we do this together as a community. Through the chair, I'd just like to address Councilman Frangelico, I think Kobe's comment. As a teacher, I just have to say it's not all about the scores. So I just have to put that out there. I want to kind of dovetail on what the superintendent said, because I think it's really, really important. This is an informational session. And so just a couple of things. Pre-pandemic, mental health challenges for children were already up about 16%. People ask, how many people does it take to take care of these kids? Since the pandemic, there's been a 33% increase in divorce. 2 out of every 5 jobs lost since the pandemic may in fact not come back, which is still about a 42% folks are still unemployed. we still have a huge disruption for children in routines, social isolation, which leads to the majority of diagnoses are anxiety and depression. There is a 40% diagnoses in high school students for suicidal behaviors since the pandemic. We have a 20% increase in mental health, emotional, developmental, or behavioral disorders in elementary and middle school children since the pandemic. That is all emotional dysregulation. Now, we know this, we see this, we know students have had learning loss. What we also need to understand is that adults also have this emotional dysregulation. The very definition of the pandemic was uncertainty, fear, and there's no end in sight. COVID has not gone away. It's with us. It's going to be with us for a long time, like the flu, like the common cold. But we do still have a decrease in children's routine health care, their ability to access dental care and vaccinations. We have children who have seen, unfortunately, death, who have housing insecurity and food insecurity. So when people are looking at only decreased enrollment, we are in the business of humans, little humans to bigger humans. And the needs that we are seeing, we may be down 100 students right now, and I know that's not the correct number, but the needs that we're seeing just for typically developing students and families could be the needs of 200 students. And yet we can sit them in the same size room or the same size building, but unless they're going to be sitting at desks and not moving around, it's not going to be productive. If we don't acknowledge that a problem still exists overall, we have best practices in schools and in businesses, but those practices were made for a pre-pandemic world that does not exist. We have buildings that need maintenance, and as we have children that need support, we have families that need support, and I'm just going to really back up what Lucas said. Fighting, and that's not even the right word, but really pushing for what our children need, and it is a need, it is not a want. No way, in no way, takes away from what our colleagues in the fire department and the police department or any other department needs. But these are our children, and this is our future, and they deserve every support that we can give them. Again, it's not to take away from anybody else, but they deserve 150% of what we can give them. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Is there anyone else please come forward, name and address, please.
Hi there, I'm Selena Cousin, 114 Beach Street. I just wanna, I hope I'm not the only one feeling this, but I might be, and I'm gonna say it. I'm sort of feeling like we don't feel a sense of urgency here. I feel like this is something that we need to do as expediently, quickly, carefully, yes. Getting everybody involved, yes. Educating everyone, yes. But, I've been attending school committee meetings since 2002, way back with, Mr. Crisafulli, and then we went on to, we're 5 superintendents later, and 4 superintendents ago, we were saying, he left because he couldn't, in good faith, run the schools with the kind of cuts he was being have to make. And that was before Lucas, before Sarah, before Maureen, right? And so as a parent, I'm speaking as a parent, I'm also an educator, but as a parent, I'm seeing my kid have study hall with 125 kids. I'm seeing my child have no science teacher until like the end of October because they can't hire one. I'm seeing my kid have no English teacher for a few months because we let them go and now we can't rehire enough people. Franklin is only as good as our weakest link. And I'm going to say it, our weak link right now is the schools, and that's not a reflection at all. We have fantastic teachers, we have fantastic school committee, and I think we might have the best superintendent we've had yet since in my 20 years. But we are doing a real disservice to a lot of our kids and our teachers right now. The turnover is ridiculous. In 5 years at Horace Mann, there have been 5 assistant principals. It's just the teacher turnover and what's going on with the kids and having these classes for a whole year with no teacher and huge amounts of kids in study halls, which I'm sure you can imagine leads to behavior problems. My concern is that I'm feeling like if our next meeting is until like October and we're gonna kind of make sure we don't get past the election, then we gotta retrain everybody because none of us will be here, or some of us will be here, but some of us won't. I just wanna feel like there's more urgency going on here because I think our kids deserve it.
Jamie.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So the last couple comments of the last 2 speakers, I would hope that most listeners agree with the sentiments that those folks said. I think we all know that what they're speaking to are needs and problems within the district. I agree on the urgency. I'm just going to emphasize it one more time. Somebody someday has to quantify a dollar amount to these issues. So we have problems with retention or a science teacher or the mental health needs or all these issues. I think the chore here is we need the school department to work with my office and our finance team to quantify this. I think if we don't quantify how to solve these problems with actual dollars, policy decisions, whatever it is, I think we're going to be back here next year and probably have the same problems coming up to the mic, and Donna, who spoke so eloquently as she always does, is going to come up and say the same thing. So I agree with the urgency. I think everybody does. But I think where we're at is we have to create the space and time. I wish there was a fly on the wall every once in a while in our office, Lucas, because I see him every day. He sees me. We run in, run out, see each other. We're cordial. We meet well together. We work well together. We have no time. It's just as simple as that. I'm sorry. And I'm expressing a little frustration because it's just too much. And if we're going to get to these issues, and we're going to hear these people's concerns, and we're going to respond to all these parents, somewhere, somehow, someone's just got to say, people just have to squeeze out a lot of extra work. To quantify this is a lot of work. And I'm not complaining. I don't want any empathy. I'm not looking for pity. Everyone knows I'm a hard worker. I just got to say it because we've got to turn this. This is the corner that's got to be turned.
And Jamie,
we're going to get there. Otherwise, we are going to be dogs chasing our tails, and we're going to sit here and go, not just 13 years with no conversation. It'll be 14 years. It'll be 15 years. We have to carve out the space and the priorities to be able to look at this. Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Jamie. And again, I don't believe that there's anyone sitting on this rostrum tonight that doesn't feel the sense of urgency that's needed. The issue is getting the information. And I think one of the things we need to walk away from, or the people on this rostrum need to walk away from this meeting with, is council members need to support to the rest of the council the need to allow Jamie and the administrative team the time to put the work into what we need to get done. And the same thing needs to happen with the school committee and the superintendent of schools. They have to give the superintendent of schools and the business manager the opportunity to do the work necessary as quickly as possible. But again, we need to do it right. Because in fairness to the entire community, we, as I stated in my opening statement, we need to put the right question out there if that's where we're going. And that takes a lot of work, as Jamie's alluded to, but we can get it done. Sure, Lucas, please. I don't know why you're sitting up back. You need to be up front.
I know, I was just trying to be creature of habits. That's where I landed. I want to.
be nice too.
You've been following McLaughlin and Lynch.
I've been in that seat.
know.
In all fairness, if you watch some archived footage, you'll know that I've been in that seat enough already for a decade. I will say we are hitting the ground running. I just want to be responsive to some of the families here. To Jamie's point, bandwidth is our reality, so we don't want to make false promises on what we do. But there's a sense of urgency. I just wanted to speak and let you know we've talked about this. There's a sense of urgency on our part to work through the three things that I opened with when I spoke earlier around a comprehensive school facilities analysis, a multi-year strategic plan. We just finished day 2 of our administrative retreat with all principals, and we have begun the work of our strategic planning on the educational side of things. What are we hoping to accomplish? And the theme this year has been focus. How do we get focused and real and articulate around what we actually can accomplish with the time and resources we currently have to move student performance and student growth forward? The third is long-range budget modeling. This is an example. It ties in. We're all interrelated. And the last thing I wanted to do, if it's okay with you, Chairman Mercer, was just introduce our school business administrator who's here tonight.
Absolutely.
Our interim school business administrator. Come on up. This is Dr. Bob Dutch. I just wanted to put a face to the name, particularly in a meeting like this when we talk about budget and finance. I was fortunate to work with Mrs. Goodman for many years, but as a superintendent for 1 year together. And one thing that was important to me was continuing to have someone in the role who had the experience and the knowledge around school finance to be able to support our system. So as an interim, Dr. Dutch is joining us. He goes by Bob, but just trying to be respectful to his role. He is a retired superintendent, is serving as a mentor for me in many ways in that capacity. But he's also worked as a school business administrator, and he's already in 30 days hit the ground running with his own take and analysis on things, and brings a perspective and an experience to the position that I think will help us gather the information we need to do, which will take some time, but he's ready to hit the ground running. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity, Bob, to say a little bit.
Thanks, Lucas. Hello. Welcome. I do want you to know that Jamie told me, Lucas told me I was coming to Shangri-La. He didn't tell me I was going to have to do all this work. An override. But I'm ready to help him out with this, and we understand the urgency, and we'll do what we can to get there realistically. Okay? Thank you. Thank you, Bob. And certainly welcome aboard. Okay, is there any other questions in council chambers? Any other questions on Zoom? Committee? Sure, if you'd like.
If you want one other action item, I'd be remiss to say that part of all of this is electing leaders that share your values and vision for the community. That's what it is.
Thank you, Councilor Frangillo. Okay. In closing, I'd just like to say what I'm sure all of you are thinking out there, and everybody here is thinking, and that is, I know we've talked about a lot about the municipal part of government and the schools part of government, but we have to remember we are one community, we are one Franklin, and we need to continue to look forward with that in mind. We are one community, and if we stay one community, we will succeed, I'm sure of it. So with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
My favorite words, non-debatable. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Folks, thank you all, one and all, for coming this evening.